Chapter 1. The Proposal. The Drevnar stronghold loomed before Lady Maelis Velthorne like a dark promise. Its towers clawed at the storm-streaked sky, their jagged silhouettes casting ominous shadows across the mountain pass. Black iron gates creaked open as her entourage approached, the grinding sound reverberating like a warning. Maelis sat tall atop her mare, her posture regal and unyielding, her expression a mask of calm authority. The grand hall was no less imposing. Walls of obsidian stone absorbed the flickering torchlight, making the space feel like an endless cavern. Crimson banners, embroidered with the sigil of House Drevnar, a black wolf poised mid-snarl, hung like sentinels above the long banquet tables. The air was heavy with tension, and the faint metallic tang of burning oil. Maelis strode through the hall with measured grace, her boots echoing against the stone floor. The weight of 100 stairs pressed against her like a tangible force. Court advisors and warriors sat stiffly along the edges of the room, their expressions a mix of distrust and curiosity. She felt their scrutiny as if it were a blade against her back, but her chin remained high, her storm-gray eyes unflinching. Ahead, atop a dais carved from the same unyielding stone, sat King Deyric Drevnar, a man who exuded power like a storm on the horizon. His cold, calculating smile greeted her with the precision of a well-sharpened weapon. His dark hair was streaked with silver, pulled back to reveal a face etched with sharp angles and a piercing gaze the color of frost. "Lady Velthorne," Deyric said, his voice smooth and edged with mockery. He rose slowly, the black cape draped over his shoulders rippling like liquid shadow. "You honor my house with your presence." The words dripped with civility, but Maelis heard the undercurrent of menace. She stopped at the foot of the dais, letting the silence between them stretch, just long enough to become uncomfortable. "King Deyric," she replied, her tone even, her voice carrying over the oppressive quiet of the room. "Honor has little to do with necessity." A flicker of amusement crossed his face, though his pale eyes remained cold. He gestured toward the seat across from his throne, a subtle insult, placing her below him both literally and symbolically. Maelis ignored the slight, gliding to the chair as though she were the one granting him an audience. The advisors murmured among themselves, their whispers a current of discontent, but one figure near the shadows stood silent. Kael Raventhorn, Deyric's personal bodyguard, watched her with an intensity that sent a flicker of unease down her spine. His green eyes, sharp and unreadable, tracked her every move, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his blade. "Your journey must have been arduous," Deyric said, lowering himself onto his throne. The word carried a thinly veiled barb. "I endure what I must," Maelis replied, meeting his gaze with unwavering confidence. "Just as I'm sure you do, Your Grace." Deyric's lips curled slightly, though whether it was a smile or a sneer was unclear. "Indeed. Perhaps that is why we are here today. Endurance and ambition are the pillars of an enduring alliance, wouldn't you agree?" Maelis leaned back, folding her hands in her lap with calculated elegance. Ambition can be a fine tool, but it cuts both ways. As for alliances, her gaze swept across the room, taking in the sea of suspicious faces. Trust is a rarer commodity. A ripple of tension passed through the court, and Maelis felt Kael's eyes on her, their weight pressing against her like a silent challenge. For a fleeting moment, her composure wavered, the flicker of heat in his gaze stirring something she couldn't quite name. "Trust," Deyric echoed, his tone almost amused. "A luxury we can't afford. Which is why this alliance must be forged in something stronger. Something immutable." "Such as?" Maelis asked, arching a brow. Deyric's smile sharpened, his hands gripping the armrests of his throne. "Marriage." The word dropped like a stone into the room, silencing the whispers and drawing every gaze to her. Maelis felt the shift in the air, the tension coiling tighter, as though the walls themselves waited to see her response. She allowed herself a moment of stillness, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then, with a calm, deliberate tone, she replied, "A bold proposal, Your Grace. But boldness alone does not guarantee success." Deyric leaned forward, his smile widening. Then perhaps we should discuss the terms of this success. The room erupted into murmurs once more, but Maelis didn't hear them. Her focus was locked on Deyric, and out of the corner of her eye, on Kael, silent, watchful, and utterly unreadable. The game had begun. The room grew heavier, the air thick with the weight of expectation. The murmurs of the court faded into silence as King Deyric Drevnar leaned back in his throne, steepling his fingers. His pale eyes gleamed with calculation, their intensity fixed on Lady Maelis Velthorne. "The proposal is simple, Lady Velthorne," Deyric began, his voice smooth as silk yet laced with quiet menace. "A union between House Velthorne and House Drevnar. Your trade routes and wealth paired with my armies and political influence. Together we become an unshakable force capable of quelling any rebellion, silencing any rival. Together we could ensure peace on our terms." The words were perfectly chosen, polished and sharp, but Maelis could hear the unspoken threats beneath them. "On our terms" was not a promise but a warning. He was offering her power, yes, but at the cost of her autonomy. She allowed a small smile to curl her lips, a delicate, practiced expression that gave away nothing. "Peace," she said slowly, her voice carrying through the hall. "A noble aspiration, Your Grace, but peace forged through domination is fragile. It breaks at the first sign of weakness." Deyric chuckled, the sound low and humorless. "Then it is fortunate that neither of us is weak, isn't it?" The court laughed nervously, though their eyes flicked between Maelis and their king, as though watching a duel. Maelis tilted her head, her gaze unyielding. "Strength must be balanced with trust, Your Grace. And trust is not earned through words alone." For a fleeting moment, a flicker of irritation crossed Deyric's face before his mask of charm returned. "Trust can be built in time," he replied smoothly. "But alliances must begin somewhere. A political marriage is the most efficient way to secure our partnership. Think of it, Lady Velthorne. The union of our houses would be legendary." The word tasted sour, but Maelis did not let it show. "And what guarantees do I have that your ambitions will not eclipse this partnership? That my house will not become merely an extension of yours?" Deyric's smile widened, though it did not reach his eyes. "Your brilliance and ferocity are renowned, my lady. I doubt anyone, least of all myself, could ever overshadow you." The flattery was calculated, yet she caught the faintest glimmer of condescension beneath it. The man believed himself in control of this game, but Maelis had no intention of being anyone's pawn. "I will consider your proposal," she said, her tone even and unyielding. "Wise," Deyric replied, the single word both acknowledgement and challenge. The meeting dissolved shortly after, though the tension lingered like smoke in the air. Maelis turned from the dais, her steps precise and deliberate, as she moved toward the towering double doors at the far end of the hall. Her mind churned, dissecting every word, every glance exchanged in that chamber. The weight of a presence at her side drew her attention. Kael Raventhorn moved into step with her, his movements fluid and silent, as though he were a shadow given form. "Lady Velthorne," he said, his voice low, almost intimate in the cavernous hall. "I am to escort you to your chambers." She glanced at him, noting the sharpness in his features, the chiseled jaw, the faint scar that curved over his cheekbone, the piercing green eyes that held a depth she couldn't yet decipher. His presence was both unsettling and magnetic, a paradox that pricked at her defenses. "An escort?" she replied, arching a brow. "Do you believe I require protection within these walls?" "Protection is not always about need, my lady," Kael said evenly, his tone devoid of emotion. "Sometimes it is about presence." His words were vague, but there was something in the way he said them that unsettled her. Maelis studied him out of the corner of her eye as they walked. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who knew how to kill, but there was a quiet storm beneath his calm exterior. As they ascended the spiraling staircase to her chambers, the torchlight cast flickering shadows across the walls. Kael's silence was unnerving, and yet it wasn't empty. It was watchful, deliberate. When they reached her door, Kael stopped, his gaze steady on hers. "If there is anything you require, my lady," he said, his voice quiet but firm, You need only call for me. Do all of Deyric's men offer such personal attention? She asked, her tone laced with subtle challenge. Kael's expression didn't shift, but his eyes darkened, just enough to quicken her pulse. I am not like the others. It was an innocuous statement, but it lingered in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. For a moment, neither of them moved, the quiet tension coiling tighter. Then Maelis inclined her head, breaking the spell. "Good night, Kael," she said, her voice steady despite the flicker of heat that had stirred within her. He stepped back, his movements smooth and precise, and melted into the shadows of the corridor as if he had never been there. Maelis closed the door behind her, her composure intact, though her thoughts betrayed her. Deyric might think himself the most dangerous man in the stronghold, but Kael Raventhorn was a riddle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. The chamber Maelis had been assigned was luxurious, though its cold opulence did little to comfort her. Polished obsidian walls reflected the flickering glow of a massive hearth, its flames dancing like restless spirits. A single window overlooked the darkened mountains, their jagged peaks veiled in mist. Heavy crimson drapes framed the window, their embroidered edges glinting faintly in the firelight. Maelis stood before a long table strewn with maps and correspondence, her hands resting lightly on its edges. She could feel the weight of the decision before her pressing against her ribs, a sensation as constricting as the steel corset she often wore beneath her gowns. Her advisors flanked her, their faces marked with concern and skepticism. Among them stood Marla Greystone, her most trusted confidante and second in command. Marla's sharp hazel eyes scanned the documents with the precision of a hawk, her auburn hair tied back in a severe knot. "You're playing a dangerous game, Maelis," Marla said, her voice low but firm. "Deyric is a wolf in silk. He'll bare his teeth the moment he sees an opening. And I will ensure he finds none," Maelis replied, her tone cool and unwavering. "Forgive me, my lady," Marla continued, stepping closer, "but Deyric's reputation isn't built on empty boasts. He's betrayed every ally he's ever had once their usefulness ran dry. Do you truly believe he'll treat you any differently?" Maelis straightened, her storm gray eyes meeting Marla's unflinchingly. "I don't need his loyalty," she said. "I need his resources, his armies. The alliance is a tool, not a bond of trust. If he seeks to betray me, he will find I am not so easily unseated." The room fell silent for a moment, save for the crackling of the fire. Marla exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You know I'll stand with you no matter what." But this she gestured toward the maps. The trade routes, marked in ink, and the territories shaded in blood red. "This marriage binds you to a man who thrives on chaos. I just hope the risk is worth it." Maelis allowed herself a moment of stillness, her gaze drifting to the window and the storm-shrouded mountains beyond. The weight of her house's survival pressed down on her like an iron crown. "If I refuse," she said softly, "we stand alone against a sea of enemies. House Drevnar is too powerful to ignore, and the other houses are circling like vultures, waiting for a sign of weakness." She turned back to Marla, her expression hardening. "This alliance might be the only way to secure Velthorne's future, and if Deyric underestimates me, he will learn the cost of doing so." Marla studied her for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. "Then we proceed. But promise me you'll watch your back, Maelis. Deyric isn't the only danger here." "I always do," Maelis said, a flicker of a smile ghosting across her lips. The discussion continued late into the night, strategies dissected and contingencies planned. But even as Maelis spoke, her thoughts wandered. Not to Deyric, with his polished charm and veiled threats, but to Kael Raventhorn. His presence had unsettled her in a way she hadn't expected. The way he moved silent, deliberate, as though he was both protector and predator made her blood quicken with awareness she couldn't explain. And those eyes, they had watched her with an intensity that felt like a challenge, a silent declaration that he saw her not as prey, but as an equal. It was dangerous to let her thoughts drift toward him. More dangerous still to acknowledge the flicker of intrigue he had sparked within her. Maelis dismissed her advisors, their bows respectful but tinged with unease. Alone at last, she stood before the window, her reflection merging with the storm beyond. Lightning flashed, illuminating the dark peaks in a burst of silver. If Deyric is the wolf, she murmured to herself, then what does that make you, Kael Raventhorn? She didn't have an answer, but she knew she needed one. Because in this game of power and betrayal, every piece on the board mattered, and Kael was far from an ordinary piece. Chapter 2. Unisialis. The grand dining hall of Drevnar stronghold was an opulent contradiction, a space both magnificent and foreboding. Walls of black stone gleamed under the flickering light of 100 torches, their flames casting restless shadows across the room. Banners of House Drevnar hung from the vaulted ceilings, their crimson embroidery depicting a snarling black wolf, as if reminding all present of the power that lurked behind the throne. The long banquet table was laden with platters of roasted meats, jewel-like fruits, and gilded goblets overflowing with wine. The air was thick with the mingling scents of spiced venison, fresh bread, and smoke from the fire roaring in the massive hearth. The din of clinking goblets and murmured conversation hummed like a distant storm, but the atmosphere was charged with tension. Lady Maelis Velthorne sat at the head of the table beside King Deyric Drevnar, her posture a portrait of poise and authority. The crimson gown she wore clung to her like a second skin, the silver embroidery along the neckline catching the firelight with every subtle movement. Her storm-gray eyes flicked over the table, taking in the faces of Deyric's advisors and courtiers, each one a potential ally or threat. Lady Velthorne, Deyric's voice cut through the din, smooth and deliberate. I trust the accommodations have met your expectations. Maelis turned her gaze to him, her expression serene yet unyielding. They are adequate, she replied, the faintest edge of sarcasm threading her words. Deyric's lips curled into a smirk, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. Adequate. High praise from one as exacting as yourself. He raised his goblet in a mock toast. To adequacy, then. The courtiers laughed, their chuckles as shallow as the goblets they drank from. Maelis's smile didn't falter, but inside she felt the familiar coil of irritation. Every word from Deyric was a carefully honed blade, meant to prod and test her defenses. I find that adequacy often surprises those who underestimate it, she said smoothly, lifting her own goblet. Her gaze held his, a silent warning that she was no stranger to this game. Deyric chuckled, his laugh low and dangerous. A fair point, he said, leaning closer. The golden brooch at his collar glinted as he shifted, the black wolf etched into it catching the firelight. But I suspect you did not come here to speak of adequacy or surprises. You came for something far greater, something only I can offer. Maelis tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Perhaps. Or perhaps I came to see what it is you seek to gain from this alliance. Gain. His smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Why, peace, of course. Stability for our houses. A chance to rule a united kingdom with unmatched power. And all under your terms, I presume, Maelis said, setting her goblet down with deliberate care. Deyric's expression didn't falter, but the faintest flicker of annoyance crossed his eyes. Unity requires compromise, he said. Surely you understand that, as well as I do. I understand that compromise must benefit both parties equally, Maelis countered, her voice steady but sharp. And I understand that wolves rarely share their prey willingly. The laughter around the table faltered, replaced by a tense silence. Deyric's smirk softened into something more dangerous, a predator assessing its rival. You are as clever as they say, Lady Velthorne, he said, his voice lowering. And just as fierce. It is no wonder your house has thrived under your leadership. But even the fiercest leader cannot stand alone forever. Alliances are not merely options, they are necessities. The words hung between them like a challenge. Maelis met his gaze, unflinching. And yet, the strongest alliances are built on trust, not veiled threats. Wouldn't you agree, Your Grace? Deyric chuckled again, leaning back in his chair. Of course, he said, his tone light but his eyes hard. Trust, as you so wisely said, is earned. The tension in the room was almost tangible now. like the air before a storm. Maelis could feel the weight of every gaze, the quiet calculations being made by those around the table. But she kept her focus on Deyric, refusing to let him see even the smallest crack in her composure. From the shadows near the edge of the room, Kael Raventhorn watched the exchange with silent intensity. His green eyes flicked between the two, his expression unreadable but his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. The flickering torchlight danced across the scar on his cheek, a stark reminder of the dangers that came with this world of power and ambition. Maelis didn't look at him, but she felt the weight of his gaze, steady and unwavering. It was a strange comfort, knowing he was there, even if she couldn't yet trust him. "Shall we toast, then?" Deyric said, raising his goblet once more. "To trust and to the beginning of something greater than either of us could achieve alone." Maelis hesitated for only a fraction of a second before lifting her own goblet. "To trust," she echoed, though the word tasted bitter on her tongue. Their goblets clinked, the sound ringing out like a bell tolling for the start of a long and dangerous game. The quiet tension at the table felt like the taut string of a bow, moments away from snapping. Lady Maelis Velthorne sat with the poise of a queen upon her throne, her gray eyes fixed unflinchingly on King Deyric Drevnar. The air between them crackled with unspoken challenges, their words veiled in civility but sharpened like blades. "You're quick to speak of unity," Maelis said, her tone measured, "but unity is not forged by bending one party to the will of another. It requires balance." She set her goblet down with deliberate grace, the metallic clink punctuating her words. "Surely you wouldn't expect House Velthorne to sacrifice its strength simply to bolster yours." Deyric's smirk deepened, though the faint flicker of annoyance in his icy blue eyes did not escape her notice. "Sacrifice is such an unbecoming word," he said, his voice smooth but threaded with a subtle edge. "I would prefer to call it investment. A contribution toward a future where both our houses thrive." "And yet," Maelis countered, leaning forward slightly, her fingers brushing the silver edge of her goblet, "it seems your version of thriving leaves little room for my house to retain its independence." A ripple of muted gasps flitted through the courtiers, their eyes darting between the two like spectators at a duel. Maelis's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Let them whisper." Every word she spoke was a reminder that she would not be cowed, no matter how many wolves surrounded her. Deyric chuckled, the sound low and humorless. "I see your reputation for cunning is well earned, Lady Velthorne. But do not mistake my generosity for weakness." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. "This alliance is not a gift. It is an opportunity, a rare one at that. I would hate for us to squander it with obstinacy." The unspoken threat hung in the air like a blade poised above her head. Maelis tilted her head, meeting his gaze with an expression of serene defiance. "Then perhaps we should speak plainly, Your Grace. What precisely do you offer in exchange for my so-called investment? Or is your proposal as empty as the charm you wield so generously?" Deyric's jaw tightened, the flicker of irritation growing stronger, but his smile remained intact. "You are bold, Lady Velthorne," he said, his voice dropping into a quieter, more dangerous register. "A quality I respect, even if it often proves troublesome." "Trouble," Maelis said, her smile widening just slightly, "is often the precursor to change, and change is what I bring to those who underestimate me." The tension in the room deepened, a palpable weight that pressed against the silence. The courtiers exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers hushed but frantic. Deyric's smile faltered, ever so briefly, before he raised his goblet once more. "To change, then," he said, his tone smoother than silk, "and to alliances that shape the future." Maelis lifted her goblet in response, her movements precise and deliberate. "To alliances," she echoed, though her voice carried a sharper edge, "that respect strength and foresight." The subtle jab did not go unnoticed. Deyric's smile tightened, but he said nothing more, choosing instead to drain his goblet in one smooth motion. Standing just behind Deyric's throne, Kael Raventhorn watched the exchange unfold with silent intensity. His sharp green eyes flicked between the two, noting every shift in their expressions, every word that bristled with unspoken meaning. He had seen Deyric wield his charm and dominance like a blade many times before, reducing seasoned generals and proud lords to submission with little more than a smile. But Maelis Velthorne was not like them. Her composure was unshakable, her words cutting and precise, leaving Deyric to bristle in ways Kael had rarely witnessed. A flicker of something unfamiliar stirred within Kael, a quiet admiration for the woman who dared to stand toe-to-toe with the wolf of House Drevnar. She was a dangerous opponent, one who wielded her intellect with the precision of a blade. But danger was not new to him. In fact, he had spent his life thriving in its shadow. Kael's hand rested lightly on the hilt of his sword, his thumb brushing the leather-wrapped grip. It was an unconscious habit, one born of years spent guarding against threats seen and unseen. As he watched Maelis, he found himself questioning which she would become, a threat, or something far more complicated. Her voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and commanding. "And now, if your grace has nothing more to add, I believe the hour grows late." Deyric inclined his head, his expression schooled back into careful civility. "Of course. My men will see you to your chambers. Rest well, Lady Velthorne. Tomorrow we will continue our discussions." Maelis rose gracefully, her gown rippling like liquid fire in the torchlight. Kael stepped forward without waiting for a command, his movements fluid and precise. "I will escort her," he said, his voice calm and even. Deyric shot him a glance, his blue eyes narrowing briefly before he nodded. "Very well." Kael moved to Maelis's side, his presence a shadow against her fiery intensity. As they left the hall, the sound of their footsteps echoed in the silence they left behind. He did not speak, but he could feel her gaze flicker toward him briefly, a silent acknowledgement of his presence. She, too, said nothing, her expression as unreadable as his. But the tension that lingered between them felt heavier than words, a quiet, simmering thing that neither seemed willing to name. For Kael, it was a question left unanswered. For Maelis, it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. The balcony was a stark reprieve from the suffocating grandeur of the hall. The cold night air wrapped around Lady Maelis Velthorne like a shroud, tugging at the loose strands of her dark hair and biting against the exposed skin of her shoulders. The stone railing beneath her hands was slick with moisture from the mist that clung to the peaks surrounding Drevnar's stronghold. Far below, the world was swallowed by darkness, save for the faint glimmers of torchlight from the gates. The silence of the mountains felt infinite, broken only by the occasional whistle of the wind through the crags. Maelis closed her eyes for a moment, letting the chill settle the restless storm inside her chest. Deyric's veiled threats and calculating charm lingered like an aftertaste, bitter and cloying. She had not expected the game to be easy, but the weight of navigating his treachery and the pressure of protecting her house gnawed at the edges of her resolve. "You held your ground." The deep voice cut through the stillness, low and even, yet threaded with something she couldn't quite name. Maelis turned her head sharply, her gray eyes narrowing as Kael Raventhorn emerged from the shadows of the archway. He moved with a quiet grace, the dark leather of his armor blending into the night, as though he were part of it. The faint scar on his cheek caught the moonlight, adding an edge to his already rugged features. "I didn't realize I was being evaluated," she said coolly, her fingers tightening on the railing. Kael stopped a few paces away, close enough for his presence to be felt, but far enough to respect her space. His green eyes glimmered in the faint light, assessing her with a steady intensity that made her skin prickle. "Not evaluated," he replied. "Observed. Is that supposed to comfort me?" she asked, arching a brow. Kael's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "I suppose that depends on whether you believe observation is a prelude to action." Maelis studied him, her gaze sharp and searching. "And what action do you intend to take, Kael Raventhorn? Are you here to deliver a warning? Or simply to remind me that you are always watching?" The faintest flicker of amusement passed over his face, gone so quickly she wondered if she had imagined it. "A warning implies I have something to fear for you. That is not the case." Her jaw tightened, her posture stiffening. "Then what is it you want?" He took a single step closer, his boots silent against the stone. To tell you that Deyric does not often find himself outmaneuvered. Tonight you caught him off guard. Her breath hitched, though she masked it with a small tilt of her head. You sound impressed. Perhaps I am, Kael admitted, his voice soft but firm. His green eyes held hers, unflinching. Or perhaps I'm simply intrigued. Maelis's pulse quickened, though she refused to let it show. His words carried no overt threat, yet there was something dangerous about the way he spoke, as if he saw more than he should, as if he already knew how this game would play out. I have no use for intrigue, Kael, she said, her tone as cold as the air around them. I came here for alliances, not riddles. And yet, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, you stand here speaking to me instead of planning your next move. The words struck a nerve, and for a moment, Maelis felt the ground shift beneath her. He was right, damn him. She had allowed herself to linger, to savor the quiet, to entertain this strange, magnetic pull between them. I find myself wondering, she said, her voice low, if you speak this way to all your king's guests, or if I am a special case. Kael's lips curved into a faint smirk, the scar on his cheek shifting with the movement. You are a special case, Lady Velthorne, but that much I suspect you already knew. Before she could reply, he stepped back, the cool distance between them reasserted in his movement. Good night, my lady, he said, his tone unreadable. I suspect tomorrow will require your sharpest blade. With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the archway, leaving Maelis alone once more. She stood there for a moment, the cold wind tugging at her gown, her thoughts swirling like the mist below. Kael Raventhorn was a puzzle, a man who moved with the precision of a predator yet spoke with the restraint of a scholar. Dangerous, she thought, her hand brushing the hilt of the dagger concealed beneath her sleeve, and utterly impossible to ignore. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Foundation. The dawn broke over the jagged peaks of Drevnar stronghold, casting pale light through the narrow windows of Lady Maelis Velthorne's temporary chambers. The glow did little to dispel the shadows clinging to the room, or the weight of the parchment she clutched in her hand. Her storm-gray eyes scanned the words again, though she already knew their meaning by heart. The lines, penned in the coded language of her spies, whispered of unrest, betrayal, and ambition. Sereth Velthorne, her cousin and a man she had once considered loyal, was mustering dissenters within her house. The report detailed secret meetings in the trading hubs her house controlled, whispers of discontent cloaked beneath calls for change. The tone of her cousin's rallying cry was laced with venom. Accusations that Maelis had become too ruthless, too ambitious, and too willing to forge dangerous alliances to maintain her grip on power. Dangerous alliances, indeed, she thought bitterly, her gaze flicking toward the window where the distant silhouette of Drevnar's banners swayed in the wind. Maelis's fingers tightened around the parchment as a sharp knock sounded at the door. Enter, she commanded, her voice steady despite the storm roiling within her. Marla Greystone, her second in command, stepped into the room. The older woman's sharp hazel eyes immediately locked onto Maelis's face, catching the tension that lingered like an invisible shroud. You've read it, I assume, Marla said, her tone a mix of resignation and anger. She didn't wait for confirmation before crossing the room, her boots clicking softly against the stone floor. I have, Maelis replied, holding up the report. Our dear Sereth seems to have developed a taste for rebellion. More than a taste, Marla corrected grimly. He's poisoning minds. Merchants, minor lords, even some of the guard captains in the outposts. He's feeding them lies about you, claiming you've abandoned the values of the house, that you're too consumed by ambition to see reason. A flicker of dark amusement crossed Maelis's face. Ambition is the backbone of our house. They forget that Sereth would be nothing without it. Marla nodded, but her expression remained grim. Even so, he's sowing doubt. And doubt is a weapon as dangerous as any blade. Maelis turned back toward the window, the morning light catching the silver threading in her dark braid. Her mind raced, cataloging every possible response to this betrayal. She could crush Sereth and his faction outright, an example to anyone who might think to follow in his footsteps. But doing so risked alienating others within her ranks. What's his endgame? She asked, her voice low. Marla folded her arms, her jaw tightening. "He wants your seat, Maelis, and he'll take it by any means necessary." The words landed like a stone in her chest, but she refused to let the weight show. She turned back to Marla, her expression sharp and unyielding. "Then we make him realize what it means to challenge me." Maelis's thoughts were interrupted by a second knock at the door. This one softer, more deliberate. "Come in," she said, her tone laced with authority. The door creaked open, and Kael Raventhorn stepped inside. He moved like a shadow, his green eyes sharp and focused as they flicked between her and Marla. "I see you've been briefed," he said, his voice low and calm. Maelis arched a brow. "And how would you know that?" Kael's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "I have a way of knowing things." Marla scowled, crossing her arms. "And do you intend to share what you know, or is this one of your cryptic observations?" Kael's gaze lingered on Maelis for a moment before he spoke. "Your cousin isn't just stirring unrest for power. He's looking to ally with an external force. My sources suggest he's been making overtures to a rival house, one that would be eager to see you fall." A chill spread through Maelis's chest, though her expression remained unreadable. "Which house?" Kael stepped closer, his movements deliberate, his voice lowering. "House Karaden. They've been seeking an excuse to challenge you for years. Sereth's rebellion gives them the perfect cover." The implications struck like a blade. If House Karaden backed Sereth, this rebellion was more than an internal threat, it was the seed of war. Maelis's jaw tightened, her mind a whirlwind of strategies and countermeasures. "If what you say is true, Sereth has overplayed his hand. He won't just face my wrath, he'll be crushed under it." Kael's green eyes met hers, his expression unreadable. "Be careful, Lady Velthorne. The more visible your power, the more they'll work in the shadows to undermine it. And you would know all about shadows, wouldn't you, Kael?" she replied, her tone sharp but not unkind. He inclined his head slightly, the scar on his cheek catching the faint light. "I would." The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them. Marla finally broke it, her voice steady. "What's the plan, Maelis?" Maelis turned to face her, her storm-gray eyes alight with cold determination. "We act swiftly and decisively. I won't give Sereth or House Karaden the time to gather their strength. If they want a war, I'll show them the true meaning of ambition." Her words hung in the air, a declaration of intent. And as she glanced at Kael, who stood like a silent sentinel at her side, she couldn't help but wonder if his knowledge of shadows would prove to be her greatest weapon, or her greatest risk. The light filtering through the narrow windows of Maelis's chamber was pale and cold, casting long, spectral shadows across the black stone walls. A single iron chandelier hung above, its flickering flames failing to warm the chill in the air, or the chill that settled in Maelis's chest as she stared down at the parchment before her. The message, laden with the weight of betrayal, seemed to taunt her with every line. Sereth Velthorne, her own blood, was not only rallying dissenters, but sowing doubt in her leadership, using her tenuous alliance with King Deyric Drevnar as his blade. "He'll spin this alliance as proof of weakness," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "To him, my reaching out for support is a sign that I cannot hold the house on my own." Marla Greystone stood across the table, her expression grim but unwavering. "He's a fool if he thinks you'd ally with Deyric out of desperation. You're fortifying your position, not crumbling under pressure." Maelis let out a soft, humorless laugh, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "Fortifying or not, perception is as deadly as reality. If Sereth convinces enough people that I am no longer fit to lead, their doubts will fester into rebellion." Marla's hazel eyes narrowed. "Then we don't give him the chance to spread his lies. We expose him for what he is, a viper in your midst." "That's easier said than done," Maelis replied, her gaze drifting toward the window. The jagged peaks of the mountains loomed beyond, their tips shrouded in swirling mist. "Sereth knows the game. He won't overplay his hand unless he's certain he has enough support to force mine. This alliance with Deyric, it's the leverage he's been waiting for." A knock at the door drew their attention. A young messenger entered, bowing deeply before placing another scroll on the table and retreating without a word. Maelis reached for it, her eyes scanning the contents quickly. "It's worse than we thought," she said, her voice low but steady. "Sereth's been meeting with merchants and minor lords, promising them shares in the trading routes, if they pledge their loyalty to him. He's weaving a net beneath us while we stand on the edge of it." Marla slammed a hand on the table, her frustration palpable. "If that snake thinks he can dismantle your house with bribes and half-truths, then he doesn't know who he's dealing with." Maelis's gaze snapped back to her second-in-command, the fire in her storm-gray eyes igniting with resolve. "No, he doesn't. But he will." She straightened, the fabric of her crimson gown catching the light, as she moved with the grace of a queen preparing for war. "Marla, I need you to strengthen our defenses. Triple the guards at every major outpost and ensure our trade caravans are armed to the teeth. If Sereth wants to test my hold, he'll find it unbreakable." Marla nodded sharply. "And the dissenters?" "We'll deal with them," Maelis said, her voice cold as iron. "But not yet. First we need more information. I want eyes on Sereth's every move. His allies, his plans, his weaknesses. If he so much as breathes out of line, I want to know about it." The older woman's lips curved into a grim smile. "Consider it done." As Marla exited, Maelis turned toward the window, her reflection superimposed on the misty mountains beyond. She felt the weight of the moment pressing against her, the crushing burden of leadership in a world where every decision could tip the scales toward survival or ruin. The faint creak of the chamber door interrupted her thoughts. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. "Kael," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. "I thought you might want to know," Kael Raventhorn said, his voice as quiet and steady as the night, "that Deyric's advisors have been whispering about the unrest in your house." Maelis turned, her gray eyes locking onto his sharp green ones. "And what, exactly, are they saying?" Kael stepped closer, his presence both imposing and oddly comforting. The scar on his cheek caught the faint light as he spoke. "That your cousin is more than a thorn in your side. They believe he's planning to leverage the alliance with Deyric to claim your throne." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her mind working through the implications. "So Deyric knows." "He suspects," Kael corrected. "He hasn't acted on it yet, but it's only a matter of time before he sees an opportunity in Sereth's rebellion. If that happens, Deyric will use it to tighten his grip on me," Maelis finished, her tone bitter. Kael inclined his head. "He'll frame it as support, but we both know it would be a leash." Maelis felt a surge of anger rise within her, a fire that burned through the creeping sense of helplessness. "Then I'll ensure he doesn't get the chance. Sereth may think he can use Deyric as a weapon against me, but I will turn that blade back on him." For a moment Kael's gaze lingered on her, an unreadable mix of admiration and wariness flickering in his eyes. "You have a way of making enemies regret underestimating you." Her lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "That's the idea." He stepped back, the shadows of the room swallowing him once more. "I'll keep an eye on Deyric's court. If anything shifts, you'll be the first to know." As the door closed behind him, Maelis turned back to the window, the fire of her resolve steady and unyielding. Sereth might think he could unseat her, but he had forgotten one simple truth. Velthorne's power was not inherited. It was taken, forged and wielded by her alone. And she would not let it fall. The flickering light of a single candelabra illuminated the grand library, its golden glow casting long shadows over towering shelves of ancient tomes. The air was thick with the scent of parchment and leather, mingling with the faint chill of the night that seeped through the stone walls of the stronghold. Lady Maelis Velthorne sat at a carved wooden table, her posture stiff but elegant as she scanned the pages of a detailed trade manifest. The words blurred as exhaustion nipped at the edges of her focus, but she refused to yield. Every line, every figure, held the key to tightening her hold on the fragile alliances that kept her house intact. The stillness of the night was broken only by the soft rustle of paper and the occasional hiss of wind against the narrow windows. Maelis shifted, her fingers brushing against a quill as she noted a discrepancy in the records. "You work too late." The voice, deep and unerringly calm, slid out of the shadows like a blade unsheathing. Maelis's hand froze mid-motion, her eyes narrowing as she turned toward the source. Kael Raventhorn stood in the doorway, his broad frame silhouetted by the faint light of the corridor behind him. He moved forward with measured steps, his green eyes sharp and focused, the scar on his cheek catching the faint glow of the candelabra. "Should I be surprised to find you lurking, Kael?" she asked, her voice cold but steady. "You shouldn't," he replied, his tone as unreadable as his expression. He stopped a few paces from her, his presence commanding but not overbearing. A quiet library seems a fitting place for secrets to linger. Maelis arched a brow, setting her quill down with deliberate precision. "Are you here to share one of those secrets or simply to remind me of your penchant for vague warnings?" Kael's lips twitched, a faint shadow of a smile. "You always expect direct answers, don't you? I find them more useful than riddles." He stepped closer, his boots making almost no sound against the stone floor. The tension between them coiled tighter, the air charged with something unspoken. "Watch your back," he said finally, his voice low. "Betrayal often comes from where you least expect it." The words sent a shiver down her spine, though she refused to let it show. "That's hardly an insightful observation, Kael. If you have something to say it plainly." Kael's gaze lingered on her for a moment, his green eyes studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You think your enemies are outside these walls," he said quietly, "but the real danger may already be within." The weight of his words settled heavily in the space between them. Maelis rose from her chair, her movements controlled and deliberate, her storm-gray eyes locking onto his. "And what makes you so certain of this danger?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Kael didn't flinch under her scrutiny. "I've seen it before. Loyalty is a fickle thing, especially when ambition is involved." Her jaw tightened, frustration simmering beneath the surface. "You speak in circles, Kael. If you have proof of betrayal, tell me. If not, spare me the cryptic warnings." He held her gaze, the silence stretching until it felt like a physical weight. Then, as if deciding something, he took a step back. "Consider it advice," he said, his tone softer now, almost reluctant. "Take it, or leave it." Before she could press him further, he turned and moved toward the door, his form disappearing into the shadows as swiftly as he had appeared. Maelis stood alone in the library, her thoughts churning like a storm-tossed sea. She clenched her hands into fists, her nails biting into her palms as she replayed his words. Kael was no fool, and she doubted he spoke lightly, but his refusal to give her more left her both suspicious and intrigued. Why had he come to her in the dead of night? Was his warning genuine, or was he playing a game of his own? Her gaze drifted back to the documents scattered across the table, but the numbers and words now felt insignificant compared to the larger puzzle she faced. The fire in the hearth crackled, its faint light flickering across her face. Maelis lifted her chin, a steely determination settling in her expression. Whatever game Kael was playing, she would uncover the truth. And if there was a traitor within her house, they would learn the cost of crossing her. She blew out the candelabra, leaving the library in darkness as she turned and walked toward the corridor. The shadows whispered around her, but her steps did not falter. In this world of power, betrayal, and hidden dangers, Maelis Velthorne had no intention of becoming anyone's pawn. Chapter 4: The Decision. The throne room of Drevnar Stronghold was a monument to power and intimidation. Black stone walls loomed high above, their surfaces slick with an otherworldly sheen that seemed to devour the light of the massive iron chandeliers overhead. Crimson banners bearing the snarling wolf sigil of House Drevnar hung like blood-stained sentinels, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Lady Maelis Velthorne entered with her head held high, her storm-gray eyes sharp and unyielding. The subtle hiss of her crimson gown trailing behind her was the only sound as she approached the dais where King Deyric Drevnar sat, flanked by his advisors. Deyric watched her with the calm arrogance of a predator waiting for its prey to falter. His silver-streaked hair gleamed in the torchlight, and his icy blue eyes fixed on Maelis with an intensity that belied his poised demeanor. "Lady Velthorne," he said smoothly, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "I trust you've given due thought to the opportunity before us." Maelis stopped at the base of the dais, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. "Opportunity implies mutual benefit, Your Grace. I have yet to see how this arrangement serves both our houses equally." Deyric chuckled, the sound low and dangerous. He rose from his throne, descending the steps with deliberate slowness. His advisors shifted uncomfortably, their gazes darting between the two. "You mistake my intentions, Maelis," he said, the casual use of her name a calculated breach of formality. "This is not about equality, it is about necessity. You need my armies. I need your wealth. Together, we are unassailable." "Together," Maelis echoed, the word rolling off her tongue with a hint of derision. "And yet, in your version of this alliance, I see only your interests prioritized." Deyric stopped a few paces from her, his smile sharp. "What would you have me do? Offer my forces without assurances? Leave my house vulnerable to your ambitions while strengthening yours? You underestimate me if you believe I would waste such an advantage on personal gain," Maelis replied, her voice steady. "But you overreach, Deyric, if you think I would hand over my resources without securing my house's independence." The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the flickering flames in the chandeliers seemed subdued under the weight of their words. Deyric's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. "Independence is a fragile thing, Maelis. It often bends beneath the weight of survival." "And survival requires leverage," she countered, taking a step closer, her gaze locked on his. "You need me as much as I need you, and I won't be your pawn. This alliance will be one of equals, or there will be no alliance at all." A murmur rippled through the gathered advisors, but Deyric silenced them with a sharp glance. His gaze returned to Maelis, and for a moment, something darker flickered in his expression, a grudging respect, perhaps, or the recognition of a kindred spirit. "Very well," he said, his voice colder now. "Name your terms." The next hour passed in a tense exchange of demands and concessions. Maelis spoke with the precision of a blade, her words cutting through Deyric's attempts to corner her. She secured guarantees for her house's trade routes, ensuring that they would remain under Velthorne control, even with Deyric's forces deployed to protect them. Deyric, in turn, extracted promises of military support should his borders come under threat, his gaze calculating as he studied her every reaction. The air grew heavier with each agreement reached, the weight of their shared ambition pressing against the unspoken tension between them. Finally, as the terms solidified, Deyric leaned back against the edge of his throne, a faint smirk curling his lips. "You've fought well for your house, Maelis. But tell me, how far are you willing to go to ensure its survival?" Her gray eyes narrowed. "I will do what is necessary, Your Grace. Nothing more, nothing less." "Then let this be the first step," Deyric said, extending his hand, "to a future where both our houses thrive." Maelis stared at his hand for a heartbeat too long before taking it. His grip was firm, his touch cold as stone. "To survival," she said, her voice as steady as her resolve. But as their hands fell away, her gaze shifted briefly to the shadows near the edge of the room. Kael Raventhorn stood there, silent and watchful, his green eyes burning like embers. For a moment their gazes locked, and an unspoken understanding passed between them of the game they were playing, of the danger that lingered in every alliance, and of the secrets that bound them closer than they dared admit. The tension in the throne room had grown as thick as the shadows that pooled in its corners. The flickering torchlight struggled to push back the darkness, casting restless patterns across the black stone walls. Maelis stood tall in the center of the room, the crimson fabric of her gown brushing the polished floor like blood spilled in defiance. Before her, King Deyric Drevnar leaned casually against the armrest of his throne, his sharp blue eyes alight with calculated interest. Around them, his advisors lingered in their seats, their gazes flitting between the two like spectators at a deadly duel. "You ask for much, Lady Velthorne," Deyric said, his tone deceptively light. "My armies, my protection. Yet you offer no guarantee of your cooperation. Relinquishing control of the northern trade routes would serve as a token of good faith, ensuring our alliance is built on trust. Trust, Maelis repeated, the word rolling off her tongue with icy disdain. What you propose is not trust, your grace it's subjugation. Deyric chuckled softly, the sound devoid of humor. Subjugation is such an unpleasant term. I prefer to think of it as partnership. Partnership, she countered, her storm-gray eyes narrowing, is founded on mutual benefit. What you demand would weaken my house, leaving us at your mercy. Deyric rose from his throne with an air of practiced ease, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the room. And what of my mercy, Maelis? Do you think it comes freely? Alliances are not built on charity, they are forged through sacrifice. Then sacrifice something of your own, she said sharply, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. If you want my loyalty, you will meet me as an equal, not as a supplicant begging for scraps from your table. The murmurs of his advisors swelled, but Deyric silenced them with a raised hand. His gaze bore into Maelis, his lips curling into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. You play this game well, he said, his tone colder now. But even the sharpest blade dulls if wielded carelessly. And even the fiercest wolf is brought to heel when it forgets its prey can bite back, she replied, her voice steady. The room fell into an uneasy quiet, the air heavy with unspoken challenges. Deyric's smile faltered, and for a brief moment, the mask of charm slipped to reveal something darker beneath an edge of frustration, perhaps, or grudging respect. At the edge of the room, Kael Raventhorn stood in shadow, his presence a quiet constant against the storm of words. His green eyes flicked between Maelis and Deyric, his expression carefully neutral, but there was a subtle tension in his posture and awareness that this exchange teetered on the edge of something far more dangerous. When Maelis's gaze briefly caught his, the weight of his silent attention anchored her in a way she hadn't anticipated. His expression was unreadable, yet there was something in the sharpness of his eyes, in the slight tilt of his head, that felt oddly reassuring. Kael saw her strength. He saw the fire that burned beneath her composed exterior, the unyielding determination that made her a force to be reckoned with, and for reasons she couldn't yet name. That knowledge steadied her, even as the walls of Deyric's power pressed down around her. Deyric's voice broke the silence, smooth and deliberate. You are uncompromising, Maelis, a dangerous trait in a leader. But perhaps that is what makes you so formidable. Maelis tilted her head, her lips curving into a small, sharp smile. And perhaps it is what ensures my house will endure. I will not relinquish control of the northern trade routes, Deyric. Not to you, not to anyone. If this alliance is to proceed, it will do so with that understanding. The tension in the room coiled tighter, the advisors exchanging uneasy glances. Deyric studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he inclined his head, though the gesture carried more calculation than concession. Very well, he said, equal control. But understand this, Maelis alliances are fragile things. If you pull too hard, they break. And if you push too far, she replied, they snap. A faint smirk touched Deyric's lips, but his gaze was as cold as the stones beneath their feet. Then let us hope we find balance, Lady Velthorne. As the meeting drew to a close, Maelis's thoughts lingered on the silent exchange with Kael. His presence, though unspoken, had felt like a lifeline, a reminder that even in the heart of the wolf's den, she was not truly alone. But as she left the throne room, the flicker of reassurance was tempered by a darker question. Was Kael Raventhorn her ally, or a shadow waiting to strike? The throne room seemed to darken as the weight of the decision settled over it. The flickering torchlight unable to chase away the shadows that crept along the edges of the chamber. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that could break or bind empires. Lady Maelis Velthorne stood in the center of the room, her storm-gray eyes fixed on King Deyric Drevnar, whose sharp smile betrayed nothing of the storm beneath his polished exterior. Her crimson gown shimmered faintly in the dim light, its silver embroidery glinting like the edge of a blade. I will agree to your proposal, she said at last, her voice steady. cutting through the suffocating silence. But let me make one thing clear, this alliance will not come at the cost of my house's autonomy. Velthorne will remain sovereign in its trade, its lands, and its decisions. Deyric's blue eyes narrowed slightly, the faintest flicker of annoyance passing through them. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the practiced charm of his carefully curated mask. He descended the steps from his throne with the grace of a predator stalking its prey, his dark cloak trailing behind him like a shadow. Such boldness, he said, his tone soft yet edged with something sharper. It is what I admire most about you, Maelis. I am not here to be admired, she replied coolly. I am here to ensure the survival of my house. If you truly wish for this union to succeed, you will accept my terms. Deyric stopped a mere pace from her, his towering form casting a long shadow over her. The faint curve of his lips was the only hint of his amusement. And if I were to refuse? Maelis tilted her head, meeting his gaze without flinching. Then this throne room will remain as empty as your promises. The faint murmur of his advisors swelled at her audacity, but Deyric silenced them with a single, raised hand. For a moment, the tension between them seemed insurmountable, the air crackling with the weight of unspoken threats and challenges. Then, unexpectedly, Deyric threw his head back and laughed, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the chamber. When his gaze returned to hers, there was a glint of something darker in his eyes. Very well, he said, his voice low and laced with intrigue. Your house will retain its autonomy. Velthorne will remain sovereign, as you so adamantly demand. The words were spoken with the precision of a dagger, their edges carefully dulled, but the sharpness of his smile suggested an ulterior motive lurking just beneath the surface. This union will be the forging of something greater, Deyric continued, stepping even closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. But let us not forget, Maelis alliances are only as strong as the trust between those who build them. Perhaps, in time, we might come to trust one another. Her lips curved into a faint smile, though it held no warmth. Trust is a luxury neither of us can afford, Deyric. I prefer certainty. Then let us seal this with certainty, he said, extending a hand. To the future of our houses and to the unbreakable bond we will forge together. Maelis hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her hand in his. His grip was firm, his skin cool against hers. The gesture was ceremonial, yet it carried the weight of a battlefield truce, fragile and treacherous. The room erupted into scattered applause, the advisors rising to their feet to acknowledge the alliance. But Maelis felt no triumph in the moment, only the cold, calculated satisfaction of a battle won, knowing the war was far from over. At the edge of the chamber, Kael Raventhorn stood in silence, his green eyes flicking between Maelis and Deyric. His expression remained unreadable, though his scarred cheek tensed slightly as the alliance was sealed. Maelis caught his gaze for the briefest of moments, and in it, she saw something that unsettled her, a flicker of tension, of warning, that sent a chill racing down her spine. As Deyric released her hand and turned to address his advisors, Kael stepped deeper into the shadows, his presence a quiet reminder of the dangers that lingered within the walls of Drevnar's stronghold. Maelis straightened, her gaze hardening. Whatever game Deyric thought he was playing, whatever secrets Kael kept hidden behind his watchful eyes, she would uncover them all. Because in this world of power, betrayal, and ambition, trust was not an option, and victory belonged only to those who knew when to strike. The throne room fell into an uneasy quiet, the applause from Deyric's advisors dying as quickly as it had begun. The air seemed heavier now, charged with the significance of the agreement. Lady Maelis Velthorne stood tall, her expression as composed as a marble sculpture. But beneath the surface, her thoughts churned with the implications of what she had just secured, and what it might cost. Deyric turned to address his advisors, his voice carrying the smooth cadence of a man accustomed to commanding a room. Words like unity, strength, and legacy echoed off the black stone walls, but Maelis's focus had shifted. Her storm-gray eyes drifted, almost involuntarily, to the shadowed edges of the room where Kael Raventhorn lingered. He stood apart from the others, a silent sentinel cloaked in leather and shadow. His green eyes, sharp and calculating, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. There was something there, something she couldn't quite decipher. Was it approval, a quiet acknowledgement of her victory in securing her house's autonomy? Or was it a warning, a subtle reminder that even victories could be fraught with unseen peril? For a moment, the noise of the room faded, the torches seemed to burn dimmer, and all Maelis could see was him. The faint scar that slashed across his cheek caught the flickering light, a reminder of the dangers he had faced, and perhaps the dangers he carried with him. His expression was unreadable, his features carved from stone, but his eyes, they burned with something deeper. She held his gaze longer than she intended, her breath catching as the weight of that unspoken connection settled over her. It was a flicker, a fleeting thing, but it left a mark. Deyric's voice snapped her back to the present, his tone laced with that calculated charm she had grown to detest. "Lady Velthorne," he said, turning toward her with a polished smile. "Shall we drink to this momentous occasion?" Maelis blinked, the spell broken. She shifted her focus back to Deyric, her mask firmly in place once more. "Of course, Your Grace," she said smoothly, though the faint edge in her voice betrayed her lingering unease. Servants moved swiftly to fill their goblets with deep red wine, the liquid gleaming like blood beneath the firelight. Deyric raised his glass, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "To our alliance," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of finality. "To our alliance," Maelis echoed, lifting her own goblet. But as she sipped the wine, her thoughts strayed back to the man in the shadows, his silent warning or approval haunting her like a whispered threat. Kael's hand rested lightly on the hilt of his sword as he watched the exchange unfold. The toast, the smiles, the outward display of civility, it was all a performance, a carefully choreographed dance between two predators. But his gaze never left Maelis. He had seen many rulers broker alliances, had watched powerful men and women navigate the treacherous waters of diplomacy. Yet there was something different about her. She wielded her words like weapons, sharp and precise, cutting through Deyric's veneer of charm with a grace that left even his advisors uneasy. It was why she intrigued him, and why she was dangerous. When their eyes met across the room, something shifted in him, a pull he couldn't quite explain. Her gaze was as piercing as ever, but beneath her composure, he caught a flicker of uncertainty, a question she didn't voice. He knew what she was asking. Even if she didn't realize it herself, could she trust him? The answer was one he couldn't give her. Not yet. As the meeting concluded and the court began to disperse, Maelis found herself lingering at the edge of the room, her mind a whirl of calculations. The terms she had secured were favorable. Yes, but the price of this alliance was yet to be fully realized. And then there was Kael. She glanced back toward the shadows where he had stood, only to find the space empty. A quiet frustration bloomed within her, mingling with the flicker of something she refused to name. He was a mystery she hadn't intended to unravel, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that he held answers she desperately needed. As she turned to leave, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished stone, a single thought lingered in her mind. Approval or warning, it was a question that would not let her rest. Chapter 5. Shadows Gather. The morning sky was a sheet of steel gray, casting a muted light over Drevnar stronghold. The faint whistle of wind through the craggy peaks said in eerie tone, as though the very mountains sensed the undercurrents of tension brewing within the fortress walls. Lady Maelis Velthorne stood before a gilded mirror in her chambers, her gaze fixed on her reflection. Her storm-gray eyes betrayed none of the storm within her. A maid fastened the silver clasps of her crimson gown, the intricate embroidery glinting faintly in the soft candlelight. The gown was meant to exude power, its fitted bodice a reminder of her authority, the sharp angles of the design echoing her own unyielding resolve. Yet today, it felt like armor, another tool in the ever-shifting battlefield she now navigated. "Are the invitations prepared?" she asked, her voice even. "Yes, my lady," Marla replied, stepping into view. Her sharp hazel eyes reflected the weight of the moment. "Every noble house of note has been informed. Their attendance is guaranteed. Good, Maelis said, her tone clipped. Let them witness this alliance. Let them see that Velthorne remains unshaken. But her words rang hollow in the heavy silence. Despite her outward confidence, Maelis knew the truth: alliances, no matter how carefully crafted, were as fragile as glass. One crack, one misstep, and everything could shatter. Marla hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line. There's more, she said finally. Maelis turned, her expression sharpening. Go on. Sereth's faction is mobilizing, Marla said. My spies report increased movement near the northern outposts. He's gathering forces. And from the looks of it, he's preparing for something decisive. The words hung in the air like the toll of a distant bell. Maelis's jaw tightened. He's chosen his moment well, she muttered. While I'm entangled in Deyric's web, he builds his own. Marla's voice softened, though her resolve did not waver. We still have the advantage, Maelis. If we act now, we can intercept his forces before they gain momentum. No, Maelis said, her voice firm. Not yet. Let him think he has the upper hand. The more confident he becomes, the easier it will be to crush him. Marla nodded, though a shadow of concern lingered in her eyes. And Deyric. I will deal with him, Maelis replied. But first we must ensure Sereth's rebellion doesn't poison the foundations of our house. Keep the northern trade routes secure. Any sign of defection, any whisper of disloyalty, deal with it immediately. As the conversation ended, the door to the chamber opened silently, and Kael Raventhorn entered with the quiet grace of a predator. He moved as though he belonged to the shadows themselves, his green eyes scanning the room before landing on Maelis. My lady, he said, inclining his head. Maelis's gaze met his, the intensity of his presence always catching her slightly off guard. In the weeks since her arrival at Drevnar, he had become an almost constant figure at her side, a silent sentinel who seemed to see more than he let on. Kael, she said, her tone cool but not unkind. To what do I owe the pleasure? He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. I thought it prudent to ensure your preparations proceed without interference. You mean without betrayal, Maelis corrected, arching a brow. Kael's lips twitched, the barest hint of amusement. Betrayal is always a possibility in a place like this. She studied him for a moment, her storm-gray eyes searching his face for any cracks in his calm exterior. But as always, Kael gave nothing away. He was an enigma, a blade hidden within the folds of a trusted cloak. Have you heard anything of note? She asked, her voice softening. Kael hesitated, his green eyes flickering with something she couldn't name. Only whispers, he said finally. But whispers have a way of growing into screams if left unchecked. His words sent a chill through her, though she refused to show it. Then let us ensure they remain whispers, she said. Kael inclined his head again but did not move. His gaze lingered on her, steady and searching, as though he was looking for something she wasn't ready to give. For a fleeting moment, the room felt smaller, the air thicker. Maelis felt the pull between them, the unspoken tension that had lingered since their first meeting. It was maddening, intoxicating, and entirely dangerous. Is there anything else, Kael? She asked, her voice sharper than intended. He straightened, the flicker of intensity in his gaze dimming. No, my lady, he said. Not yet. With that, he turned and left the room, his movements as silent as his arrival. As the door closed behind him, Maelis turned back to the mirror, her reflection a blend of power and vulnerability. The weight of her decisions pressed against her, the threads of her carefully woven plans straining under the pressure. She would face Deyric. She would crush Sereth. She would protect her house, no matter the cost. But as her thoughts drifted back to Kael, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was more than just a shadow at her side. He was a force unto himself, a force that could either save her or destroy her. And she wasn't sure which terrified her more. The halls of Drevnar stronghold were unusually quiet, their cavernous expanse holding a stillness that felt unnatural. Torches flickered along the walls, their dim flames casting restless shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Lady Maelis Velthorne stood alone on a narrow balcony overlooking the mist-drenched peaks. The cold wind tugged at the crimson folds of her cloak, sending her dark braid whipping against her back. Her storm-gray eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the pale light of dawn barely pierced the oppressive clouds. Her thoughts were a tangle of strategy and suspicion. The alliance she had fought to control now felt like a trap, its gilded bars closing around her. And somewhere within the labyrinthine corridors of Drevnar, King Deyric Drevnar schemed, with the precision of a wolf circling its prey. The sound of soft footsteps behind her broke the silence. She didn't turn, her body tense but composed. "You're restless?" came the low, familiar voice of Kael Raventhorn, his words a quiet intrusion into her solitude. Maelis exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. "Restlessness is the price of survival, Kael. Surely you know that." He stepped closer, his presence steady and grounding, though she could feel the weight of his unspoken thoughts pressing against her like the edge of a blade. "Restlessness is one thing," he said. "But doubt, that's another matter entirely." Maelis turned then, her gaze locking onto his. His green eyes, so sharp and piercing, seemed to see through her carefully constructed walls. He stood as he always did, clad in dark leather, his scar catching the faint light like a mark of fate. "And what would you know of doubt?" she asked, her tone cool but tinged with curiosity. "More than you might think," Kael replied, his voice low and measured. "It has a way of creeping in when you least expect it, especially when alliances are built on foundations that might crumble under the weight of ambition." The words sent a chill through her, though she refused to let it show. "If you have something to say, Kael, I suggest you say it plainly." Kael hesitated, the faintest flicker of conflict crossing his features. "Deyric is not a man who shares power easily," he said finally. "You may think you've secured your house's independence, but to him, this alliance is only the beginning. He'll push for more piece by piece, until there's nothing left." Maelis's jaw tightened, her storm-gray eyes narrowing. "And you know this because—" Kael's expression didn't change, though his gaze grew heavier. "Because I've seen him do it before. He promises strength, stability, but in the end, all that remains is what serves him." The weight of his words settled over her like a stone. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Why tell me this now? Why warn me at all?" Kael didn't step back, his presence unwavering. "Because you're not like the others," he said, his voice softer now, though no less intense. "You see through him, and that makes you dangerous. But it also makes you a threat to him." Her breath hitched, though she quickly masked the reaction. "You speak as though you know his mind, Kael, as though you've been part of his games before." For the first time, a shadow of something darker crossed his face, guilt, perhaps, or regret. "I know enough," he said, his voice quieter now. "Enough to see where this is heading if you're not careful." Maelis studied him, her sharp gaze searching his features for cracks in his composure. But as always, Kael was a fortress, his walls impenetrable. "Do you believe I should break this alliance?" she asked finally, the question heavy with unspoken meaning. Kael's green eyes softened just slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I believe you should trust your instincts, Maelis. They'll serve you better than anyone in this place." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a fragile thread. The wind howled around them, tugging at their cloaks, but neither moved. Finally, Kael stepped back, the distance between them a reminder of the walls they both carried. "Be careful," he said, his voice steady but laced with something unspoken. "In places like this, even shadows have ears." And then he was gone, slipping into the darkness as silently as he had come. Maelis turned back to the horizon, her thoughts churning like the storm clouds above. Kael's warning had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. His words carried the weight of truth, but his motives remained as murky as the shadows he seemed to inhabit. Was he truly an ally, or was he simply playing a game of his own? As the first rays of dawn pierced the sky, Maelis made a silent vow. Whatever games were being played within these walls, she would uncover the truth, and she would ensure that no one, not even Kael Raventhorn, stood in her way. The morning sun struggled to break through the dense fog that clung to the peaks surrounding Drevnar's stronghold, casting the courtyard in a muted, silvery light. Lady Maelis Velthorne stood by the arched stone windows of her chambers, her storm-gray eyes fixed on the barren mountains beyond. Her thoughts were as restless as the shifting mist. Kael's warning from the night before lingered, a shadow in her mind. She had replayed his words over and over, parsing their meaning, questioning his motives. Deyric was an adversary she understood, ambitious, manipulative, and predictable in his hunger for control. But Kael Raventhorn was an entirely different kind of danger, an enigma cloaked in silence, his intentions hidden behind sharp green eyes and a stoic mask. The sound of footsteps drew her attention, each step deliberate, almost hesitant. She didn't need to turn to know it was Kael. She had come to recognize his presence, the way it shifted the air around him, heavy with unspoken intensity. "You don't knock," she said, her voice cool as she turned to face him. Kael stood in the doorway, his dark leather armor blending into the shadowed stone. The faint scar on his cheek caught the light, a reminder of the life he had lived before becoming her shadow. "You didn't summon me," he replied evenly, his tone calm, but threaded with an undercurrent she couldn't quite place. "Should I have?" she asked, arching a brow. His lips twitched, not quite a smile but enough to soften the sharp angles of his face. "You seem preoccupied." Maelis studied him, her gaze sharp. "You seem eager to offer commentary." Kael stepped farther into the room, his movements fluid and measured. "You're preparing for a wedding that may secure your house or destroy it. Preoccupation seems warranted." His words cut too close to the truth, but Maelis refused to flinch. "And which do you think it will be?" Kael stopped a few paces from her, his green eyes locking onto hers. "That depends on how well you navigate the game Deyric is playing." Her jaw tightened, though she kept her expression calm. "And you, Kael? Are you a piece in his game or mine?" The question hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Kael didn't answer immediately, his gaze searching hers as though weighing the risk of honesty. "I'm here to protect you," he said finally. "But protection doesn't mean blind allegiance." The admission sent a flicker of unease through her. She stepped closer, her tone lowering. "And where do your allegiances lie, Kael?" He held her gaze, the intensity in his eyes stirring something deep within her, a mix of suspicion and something far more dangerous. "I serve my own sense of honor," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. "And that doesn't always align with the will of kings." The implication was clear, and Maelis felt the ground beneath her shift. Kael was no mere bodyguard, no simple extension of Deyric's will. He was a man with his own code, his own secrets, and perhaps his own plans. "And yet you stay," she said, stepping even closer, the tension between them coiling tighter. "Why?" His jaw tightened, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "Because there's more at stake here than Deyric's ambitions. You know that as well as I do." Their proximity was electric, the air between them charged with the weight of unspoken truths and unacknowledged desires. Maelis searched his face, her storm-gray eyes tracing the scar on his cheek, the sharp line of his jaw, the faint shadow of restraint in his gaze. "You're a dangerous man, Kael," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. His lips curved into the faintest smirk, though his eyes remained dark. "And you're a dangerous woman, Maelis. That's why this works." For a moment, the world outside the room seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of them standing at the edge of something unspoken, something neither of them dared name. But as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. Kael stepped back, the distance between them a reminder of the walls they both carried. "You should prepare," he said, his voice returning to its usual calm. "The game isn't over yet." With that, he turned and left the room, his movements as silent as the shadows he seemed to inhabit. Maelis stood in the stillness he left behind, her pulse unsteady, her thoughts a tempest. Kael's warning lingered, but so did the look in his eyes, the flicker of something deeper, something she couldn't ignore. He was an enigma, a blade she couldn't yet decide whether to wield or fear. And as much as she hated to admit it, she was drawn to him not just for the protection he offered, but for the mystery he represented. She turned back to the window, the mist-shrouded peaks seeming no clearer than the path before her. Whatever Kael's role in this game, one thing was certain. He had become a piece she could neither trust nor discard, and that made him the most dangerous player of all. Chapter 6: The Wedding Day. The grand hall of Drevnar stronghold had been transformed into a realm of opulent beauty, its austere black stone walls softened by the golden glow of countless candelabras. Rich crimson and silver tapestries adorned the arches, bearing the crests of both House Drevnar and House Velthorne, their symbols interwoven in a show of unity that felt more like a cage. The air thrummed with the low murmur of guests, nobles dressed in their finest silks, their expressions masks of feigned joy as their eyes darted between alliances and potential rivals. The scent of rare blooms imported from distant lands mingled with the tang of burning wax, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts celebration and tension. In the center of it all stood King Deyric Drevnar, his imposing figure wrapped in a cloak of deep black, embroidered with silver threads that caught the light like shards of ice. His expression was one of calm dominance, the faint curve of his lips a predator's smile. When Lady Maelis Velthorne appeared at the far end of the hall, a hush fell over the crowd. She moved with deliberate grace, her every step a declaration of strength. Her gown, a masterpiece of crimson silk and silver filigree, clung to her figure like a second skin, the intricate embroidery catching the light with each movement. A silver crown rested atop her dark hair, braided with delicate strands of gleaming metal that shimmered as she walked. Her storm-gray eyes swept the room, missing nothing: the curiosity, the envy, the quiet whispers of those who sought to unravel her. She met their gazes without faltering, her expression calm and unyielding. When her eyes locked with Deyric's, his thin smile widened, the wolf-like glint in his pale blue eyes sharper than ever. This was his game, his triumph. Or so he believed. Maelis felt the weight of every step as she approached the dais where he waited. Each movement was a carefully orchestrated display, her strength wrapped in elegance, her defiance cloaked in civility. Her heart remained steady, even as the air around her seemed to tighten, a tangible reminder of the stakes. This was no wedding born of love or trust. It was a battlefield where words and vows replaced swords, and every gesture carried the weight of unseen consequences. At the edge of the room, half hidden in the shadows of a towering pillar, Kael Raventhorn stood with the vigilance of a predator. His green eyes scanned the crowd, missing nothing: the subtle shifts in posture, the furtive glances exchanged between courtiers, the nervous tension in the servants who moved like ghosts through the throng. His hand rested lightly on the hilt of his sword, the leather-wrapped grip familiar beneath his fingers. He had seen halls like this before, filled with people wearing their ambitions like armor and their alliances like fragile chains. It was the kind of place where danger lurked behind every smile. His gaze lingered on Maelis as she ascended the steps toward Deyric. She was a vision of power and beauty, her storm-gray eyes unflinching, her every movement calculated to remind the room that she was not a pawn but a queen in her own right. Kael's jaw tightened, the faintest flicker of something unspoken crossing his face. Admiration, perhaps, or frustration. She was brilliant, fierce, but she was walking into a den of wolves, and no amount of strength could shield her from betrayal if it struck from the right angle. His eyes shifted to Deyric, whose thin smile radiated triumph. The man exuded power, but there was an arrogance to him that Kael recognized too well, the kind that made a man blind to threats he deemed beneath him. A shadow moved in the periphery of Kael's vision, and his grip on his sword tightened. The instinctual edge that had kept him alive for years surged to the forefront. The hall was filled with too many secrets, too many opportunities for danger. He would not allow anything to happen to her. Not here, not now. As Maelis reached the top of the dais, she turned to face the gathered crowd. The officiant, a robed figure adorned with symbols of both houses, began the rites in a low, sonorous voice. Maelis kept her gaze forward, her focus sharp, Deyric's presence beside her was a tangible force, his aura of dominance pressing against her own. She could feel his eyes on her, assessing, calculating, but she did not waver. Kael's warning from the night before echoed in her mind. Deyric is not a man who shares power easily. When the time came to exchange vows, Deyric's voice was smooth, his words crafted to charm the room as much as to bind her. When it was her turn, Maelis's voice rang out clear and unwavering. Each word was chosen with care, a subtle reminder that she was not submitting, but standing as an equal, or as close to it as this alliance would allow. Their hands were bound with a silver ribbon, the final step in sealing the union. As the officiant pronounced the bond, the room erupted in applause. But to Maelis, the sound was hollow, like the roar of an empty wind. Deyric leaned close, his voice a whisper against her ear. "You play the part well, Maelis. Perhaps too well." She tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a faint smile. "And you underestimate me, Deyric. Perhaps too often." As the ceremony concluded and the guests began to disperse toward the banquet hall, Kael remained in his position at the edge of the room. His green eyes followed Maelis as she descended the dais, her expression composed but unreadable. For a moment their gazes met across the room, and something passed between them, an unspoken promise, a silent warning. Kael's grip on his sword relaxed, but only slightly. The ceremony might be over, but the real danger was only beginning. The final words of the officiant echoed through the grand hall, their solemn weight settling over the gathered crowd like the closing of a tomb. Lady Maelis Velthorne and King Deyric Drevnar stood at the center of it all, their hands still bound by the silver ribbon of unity, a symbol of their alliance now sealed. The applause began slowly, hesitant at first, before swelling into a wave of polite approval. Maelis's storm-gray eyes swept over the crowd, sharp and calculating. She caught the glances of the nobles, some curious, others wary, and noted every flicker of ambition or resentment hidden behind carefully arranged smiles. Beside her, Deyric's pale blue eyes glinted with satisfaction, his lips curving into a thin, predatory smile. "And so it begins," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. "Indeed," Maelis replied coolly, though her gaze didn't waver from the audience. But then, as the applause began to fade, a faint commotion stirred near the rear of the hall. It started as a whisper, a ripple of unease passing through the gathered guests. Maelis's keen eyes darted toward the source, narrowing as she caught sight of movement in the shadows near the towering double doors. A cloaked figure emerged from the crowd, their face obscured by a heavy hood. The figure moved with purpose, their steps quick but silent, a predator weaving through unsuspecting prey. In a flash of movement, the figure drew a dagger from beneath the folds of their cloak, its blade gleaming wickedly in the flickering light. The intent was unmistakable. Maelis's body tensed, her mind racing as she calculated the distance, the angle, the time she had to react. The dagger's edge was aimed at her heart, and the cloaked figure surged forward with deadly precision. Before Maelis could move, a shadow detached itself from the edge of the dais. Kael Raventhorn, who had been standing silently in the periphery, was already in motion. His hand gripped the hilt of his sword, the blade singing as it left its scabbard. His movements were a blur, calculated, fluid, and lethal. The assassin lunged, the dagger slicing through the air, but Kael was faster. He intercepted the attack with a sharp clang of steel, his blade locking against the assassin's weapon. The force of the impact sent the cloaked figure stumbling, but they recovered quickly, shifting their stance for another strike. Kael didn't hesitate. With a swift, precise motion, he disarmed the attacker, sending the dagger clattering to the floor. The room erupted into chaos. Guests screamed, some pushing toward the exits while others froze in shock. Guards surged forward, weapons drawn, but Kael already had the situation under control. He wrenched the hood back, revealing a gaunt face etched with desperation. The assassin's eyes burned with defiance, but there was fear there too, a flicker of uncertainty as Kael's blade pressed against their throat. "Who sent you?" Kael demanded, his voice low and deadly. The assassin said nothing, their lips curling into a bitter sneer. "Enough," Maelis commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Kael glanced at her, his green eyes meeting hers with an unspoken question. After a brief hesitation, he stepped back, lowering his sword but keeping it at the ready. Guards seized the assassin, dragging them toward the center of the hall. The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Maelis descended the dais with measured steps, her crimson gown trailing behind her like a river of blood. She stopped in front of the assassin, her storm gray eyes locking onto theirs with an intensity that made them flinch. "Who sent you?" she asked, her voice cold and unyielding. The assassin's lips twisted into a grim smile. "You'll never stop him," they spat. "Your throne, your house, your life, it all belongs to him now." The words sent a chill through the hall, though Maelis's expression remained unreadable. "Take them to the dungeons," she ordered, her tone sharp. "I'll deal with this personally." The guards nodded, dragging the assassin away. The tension in the room remained palpable, the nobles exchanging uneasy glances as whispers spread like wildfire. As the guests began to disperse, Deyric stepped closer to Maelis, his voice low. "It seems your enemies are more daring than I expected." "Enemies?" Maelis said, her gaze flicking toward him. "Or yours?" Deyric's smile didn't falter, but the glint in his eyes darkened. "Careful, Maelis. A public display of mistrust doesn't bode well for alliances." Before she could respond, Kael appeared at her side, his presence steady and unyielding. His green eyes flicked toward Deyric, his expression unreadable but watchful. "I'll see to her safety," Kael said, his voice calm but firm. Deyric raised a brow, his smile thinning. "Of course. Do take care, Raventhorn. A queen is a valuable asset when she's alive." With that, Deyric turned and walked away, his cloak billowing behind him. Maelis exhaled, her composure unbroken. She turned to Kael, her voice quiet but edged with steel. "What do you make of this?" Kael's gaze lingered on her, his expression unreadable. "I think this is only the beginning," he said. "And I think we need to be ready for what comes next." The applause had barely faded when the air in the grand hall of Drevnar stronghold shifted. The murmurs of the assembled nobles faltered, a ripple of unease spreading from the rear of the room. It was subtle at first, like the faint rustling of leaves before a storm, but Maelis felt it, the instinctive tightening in her chest, the whisper of danger lingering just out of sight. Her storm-gray eyes flicked toward the disturbance, her posture remaining regal and unyielding even as the threat began to take shape. It happened in an instant. A cloaked figure broke free from the shadows near the edge of the crowd, a dagger gleaming in their hand as they surged forward, their movements swift and deliberate. The sound of fabric tearing, gasps, and a single cry rang out as the assassin charged, their blade aimed directly at Maelis's heart. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to the dagger's lethal arc. But before the attacker could close the distance, Kael Raventhorn moved. Kael had been standing near the edge of the dais, his green eyes scanning the room with the precision of a hawk. The moment the assassin's intent became clear, his body reacted before his mind fully registered the threat. His sword was in his hand in a single fluid motion, the blade whispering free of its scabbard with a deadly hiss. He stepped into the path of the assassin, his movements swift and precise, his focus narrowing to the dagger's trajectory and the figure wielding it. The clash of steel rang out, sharp and violent, as Kael's blade intercepted the dagger mere inches from its target. The force of the collision sent a shockwave up his arm, but his stance remained unyielding, his grip steady. The assassin faltered for a split second, their hood falling back to reveal a face twisted with desperation and resolve. Kael didn't wait for them to recover. With a calculated strike, he drove the flat of his blade into their ribs, knocking the wind from their lungs and sending them staggering back. The attacker regained their footing quickly, their dagger flashing in a desperate attempt to counter. But Kael moved like a shadow, his sword deflecting each strike with ease. His green eyes burned with a cold, controlled intensity, his focus unrelenting. The assassin lunged again, their blade arcing toward Kael's chest. He sidestepped, the motion effortless, and in the same breath, his sword cut through the air. The sharp edge met flesh with a sickening finality, a precise strike to the attacker's side that sent them crumpling to the polished stone floor. Blood pooled beneath the assassin, dark and glistening under the golden light of the candelabras. Kael remained poised, his blade still in hand, his gaze locked on the fallen figure as the hall erupted into chaos. "Guards." Maelis's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, cutting through the cacophony of screams and whispers. The guards surged forward, surrounding the assassin's lifeless form. Maelis descended the dais with measured steps, her crimson gown trailing behind her a river of blood. Her expression was calm, her storm-gray eyes cold as they flicked to the dagger lying uselessly on the floor. Kael turned to face her, his sword lowered but still in hand. His breathing was steady, though his jaw was set, his green eyes burning with a quiet fire. "Efficient as ever," Maelis said, her voice low but carrying enough weight to silence the remaining whispers in the room. Kael inclined his head slightly. "It's what I'm here for, my lady." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, sharp and searching. There was a question in her eyes, though she didn't voice it. Instead, she turned to the guards. "Take the body to the dungeons. I want every trace of their identity uncovered, who they are, who sent them, and why they thought they could strike here." The guards obeyed without hesitation, lifting the assassin's lifeless form and carrying it from the hall. As the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of unease and speculation filling the air, Maelis turned back to Kael. "You didn't hesitate," she said, her tone quieter now. Kael's expression remained neutral, though there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes. "Hesitation gets people killed." Maelis stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "And yet you stayed close enough to act. You anticipated this." "I've seen what desperation looks like," Kael replied, his voice low. "And this place is full of it." For a moment, the tension between them coiled tighter, the weight of the near-death moment lingering like the scent of blood in the air. "You saved me," Maelis said, her voice soft but edged with something unspoken. Kael held her gaze, his green eyes unreadable. "It's my job," he said simply, though the words carried a weight that belied their simplicity. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the moment passed. Kael sheathed his sword, his movements precise and deliberate, and stepped back into the shadows where he belonged. Maelis watched him go, her thoughts a storm of calculations and questions. Kael Raventhorn was a blade she couldn't yet decide how to wield or whether he was aimed at her heart. The grand hall of Drevnar's stronghold was a storm of chaos. Whispers and gasps rippled through the crowd like a rising tide, punctuated by cries of fear and the clatter of chairs hastily shoved aside. Nobles clustered together in uneasy huddles, their jeweled finery glinting under the flickering candelabras as they cast nervous glances toward the dais. The assassin's lifeless body, now being dragged away by guards, left a dark smear of blood across the polished stone floor, a stark reminder of the violence that had just unfolded. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air heavy with suspicion and fear. At the center of it all, King Deyric Drevnar stood with his arms raised, his voice cutting through the din with practiced authority. "This is an outrage," he bellowed, his pale blue eyes sweeping the crowd with calculated fury. "An attempt on the life of my queen, on the sanctity of this alliance. Who dares to sow such treachery under my roof?" His words struck the right chords, drawing murmurs of agreement and indignation from the assembled nobles. Yet to those who watched closely, those who knew how to read between the lines, his outrage carried an edge of performance, as polished as the gold trim on his cloak. From her place on the dais, Lady Maelis Velthorne watched the scene unfold with cold, detached precision. Her storm-gray eyes didn't waver from Deyric, catching the subtle shift in his expression as he turned toward his advisors. It was fleeting, but Maelis saw it, the brief exchange of a glance between Deyric and one of his closest advisors, a wiry man with sharp features and a carefully neutral expression. The glance was too long to be meaningless, too deliberate to be anything but a message. Maelis's lips pressed into a thin line, her mind racing. She had suspected from the beginning that this alliance would be fraught with betrayal, but this moment, this unguarded flash of connection confirmed her worst fears. Deyric's outrage was a mask, and behind it lay something far more dangerous. In the shadows near the dais, Kael Raventhorn stood with his hand still resting on the hilt of his sword. His sharp green eyes scanned the room, tracking every movement, every nervous glance, every whispered word exchanged between the nobles. He caught the same glance Maelis had noticed, his focus narrowing on the wiry advisor. Something about the man's stance, the slight tension in his shoulders, set off alarms in Kael's mind. Deyric was playing a game, and Kael had a sinking feeling that Maelis was the centerpiece of it. Kael's gaze flicked to Maelis, whose storm-gray eyes burned with cold fury. She didn't look at him, but he could feel the weight of her thoughts, calculating, analyzing, deciding. Her strength was undeniable, her composure unshakable, but Kael couldn't shake the gnawing worry that even she might underestimate the web Deyric was weaving. The crowd's whispers grew louder, their unease palpable. Who could have orchestrated this? One noble murmured, his voice trembling. An attack at the very heart of Drevnar, another hissed, her jeweled fingers clutching her husband's arm. This is no random act, it's a conspiracy. The word hung in the air, its weight pressing down on the room like a dark cloud. Maelis stepped forward, her presence commanding even amid the chaos. Her voice rang out, cutting through the noise with icy clarity. "This attempt on my life will not go unanswered," she said, her tone sharp enough to draw every eye in the room. She turned her gaze to Deyric, her expression unreadable but her meaning clear. "Your Grace, it seems there are those who would see this alliance falter before it has even begun. I trust you will not rest until we uncover who is responsible." Deyric's smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Rest assured, Maelis," he said smoothly, "I will see to it personally. No stone will be left unturned." She inclined her head slightly, but her storm-gray eyes never left his, a silent battle of wills playing out between them. As the room began to settle, Deyric moved to address the crowd once more, his voice rising with the practiced ease of a ruler. "This alliance is stronger than any threat, any cowardly act of treachery," he proclaimed, his arms outstretched. "Let this day be remembered not for fear, but for unity." The nobles murmured their agreement, but Maelis could see the cracks beneath their polished facade. Suspicion lingered in every glance, doubt in every forced smile. Deyric turned back toward her, his pale blue eyes glittering with something dark and inscrutable. "Shall we lead our guests to the banquet, my queen?" he asked, his tone laced with false warmth. "Of course," Maelis replied, her voice as smooth as glass, but as she descended the dais, her thoughts churned. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, and the picture they formed was more dangerous than she had anticipated. Deyric was not merely an ally with ambitions, he was a predator, and she was standing in the lion's den. From the shadows, Kael watched her, his green eyes sharp and unwavering. He had seen the glance, the shift in Deyric's mask, and the tension in the room that refused to dissipate. He tightened his grip on his sword, his jaw set. Whatever game Deyric was playing, Kael would ensure Maelis didn't fall victim to it, even if it meant stepping further into the shadows himself. The faint flicker of torchlight cast elongated shadows along the stone walls of Drevnar Stronghold's inner chamber, lending the room an oppressive weight that mirrored the tension within. Lady Maelis Velthorne stood near the center, her storm-gray eyes burning with a fury that even the dim light couldn't temper. Opposite her, King Deyric Drevnar leaned casually against the edge of an ornate table, his expression one of infuriating calm. His pale blue eyes held a faint glimmer of amusement, as though the chaos of the assassination attempt had been a mere inconvenience. "You call this security?" Maelis's voice was sharp, cutting through the still air like a blade. "A man slipped through your guards, armed with a dagger, and nearly reached me before he was stopped. Tell me, Deyric, what exactly is the purpose of this fortress if not to protect those within it?" Deyric's smirk widened, but the edge of danger in his eyes darkened. "I understand your frustration, my queen," he said smoothly, his tone a practiced blend of authority and false reassurance. But let us not mistake ambition for negligence. This was no failure of my guards. It was an external plot, orchestrated to disrupt our union and sow doubt among our allies. And you're certain of that? Maelis pressed, taking a step closer. The crimson fabric of her gown whispered against the cold stone floor, her presence a storm threatening to break. Because to me, it feels more like the act of someone within these walls. Someone who stands to gain from my death. Deyric's smile thinned, his gaze sharpening. A bold accusation, Maelis. But I expect nothing less from you. He straightened, his commanding presence filling the room. Rest assured, the assassin's identity will be uncovered, and those responsible, whether inside or outside these walls, will be dealt with. Maelis held his gaze, her expression unyielding. She had played this game long enough to recognize the subtle dance of deflection and manipulation. Deyric's words were calculated, crafted to placate without offering anything of substance. You had better hope so, she said coldly, because the next blade that comes for me might find its mark. Later, in the stillness of her private chambers, Maelis stood by the fireplace, her thoughts a maelstrom of suspicion and resolve. The flames danced in the hearth, their light flickering across the dark stone walls, but the warmth did little to ease the chill in her chest. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. Before she could respond, Kael Raventhorn entered, his movements as quiet and precise as always. His leather armor bore faint scratches from the earlier confrontation, and a thin cut marred his forearm, though he seemed unfazed by it. You're injured, Maelis said, her voice quieter now but still carrying its usual strength. Kael glanced at his arm, the faintest flicker of a smirk crossing his face. A scratch, nothing more. She moved closer, her storm-gray eyes scanning him for other wounds. For the first time, the sharp edges of her demeanor softened, though her expression remained guarded. You saved my life today, she said, her voice low but genuine. Kael met her gaze, his green eyes steady and unreadable. It's my duty. No, she said, her tone firm. It's more than that. You could have hesitated. You could have failed, but you didn't. For that, I owe you my thanks. The room seemed to shrink around them, the tension between them coiling like a tightly drawn bow. Kael's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, an acknowledgement of her words, and perhaps of the fragile trust that had begun to take root between them. You're not easy to protect, he said after a moment, his voice soft but laced with a hint of humor. And yet you do it anyway, Maelis replied, her lips curving into the faintest smile. As Kael moved to leave, he paused near the door, his hand resting on the iron handle. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter, more deliberate. Not all threats come from outside these walls, he said, his green eyes flicking back to her. Be careful who you trust, Molly. The words hung in the air long after he was gone, their weight settling heavily on her chest. She turned back to the fire, her thoughts racing. Deyric's deflection, the assassin's intent, Kael's warning, all of it painted a picture far darker than she had anticipated. The flames crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the room, but it was the shadows within Deyric's court that truly concerned her now. And for the first time, Maelis allowed herself to wonder, was Kael Raventhorn truly her ally or merely another piece in a game she had yet to fully understand? Chapter 7. Cracks in the Alliance. The days following the wedding were a carefully orchestrated performance. Lady Maelis Velthorne and King Deyric Drevnar stood side by side during every council session and public announcement, their faces calm, their words measured, their unity an unspoken mandate for their houses. But beneath the surface, the alliance was already fraying. The throne room, now a stage for their delicate dance of power, brimmed with tension. Deyric sat on his towering obsidian throne, his pale blue eyes gleaming with a predatory edge. Molly stood beside him, her crimson gown flowing like a river of blood, her storm-gray gaze fixed on the gathered nobles. Every word they spoke was carefully crafted, a shield against the whispers of rebellion. and dissent that lingered in the corridors of both houses. In a private council meeting days later, the mask of unity began to slip. "I've reviewed the projections," Deyric said, his voice smooth but firm as he leaned over a map of the northern trade route. "If we're to maintain the strength of this alliance, we must ensure stability in these territories. The best way to do that is for my house to assume control of the routes." Maelis's storm-gray eyes narrowed. She stood on the opposite side of the table, her hands resting lightly on its edge. "Control?" she repeated, her tone deceptively soft. "That's an interesting choice of words, Deyric. I thought the purpose of this alliance was balance, not domination." "Balance requires sacrifice," Deyric countered, his gaze locking onto hers. "Your house would still benefit from the trade. My forces would ensure security." "It's a logical arrangement." "Logical," Maelis echoed, her voice gaining an edge. "For you, perhaps. But for me, it's a thinly veiled attempt to strip Velthorne of its independence." The room fell into a tense silence. The advisors present shifted uncomfortably, their gazes darting between the two. Deyric's smile tightened, the charm in his expression fading to reveal the steel beneath. "You're making this unnecessarily difficult, Maelis. Surely you see the wisdom in—" "I see the wisdom in maintaining what belongs to me," Maelis interrupted, her voice cold as frost. She straightened, her presence commanding. "Velthorne's trade routes are not a bargaining chip to be handed over at your convenience. They are the backbone of my house's power, and they will remain under my control." Deyric rose from his seat, his height and presence imposing, but Maelis didn't flinch. She met his gaze with unyielding defiance, her expression a mask of regal calm. "This alliance was forged on the premise of mutual strength," she continued, her voice steady. "But do not mistake that for submission. I am not a queen who bows to threats or manipulations, Deyric." His pale blue eyes darkened, but he forced a smile, his voice laced with false warmth. "Of course not, my queen. The first would never suggest otherwise." "Good," she said, her tone final. "Then let us move on to matters that truly require our attention." The tension in the room was palpable as Maelis turned her focus back to the map, dismissing the conversation as though it were already settled. The advisors exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort a testament to the power struggle unfolding before them. As the meeting concluded and the advisors began to file out, Maelis lingered near the map, her fingers brushing over the edges of the parchment. Deyric approached her, his voice low. "You're playing a dangerous game, Maelis." She turned to face him, her storm-gray eyes burning with quiet fury. "And you, Deyric, are underestimating your opponent." For a moment they stood in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken threats and simmering distrust. Finally Deyric inclined his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Very well," he said. "Let's see how long this balance of power lasts." Maelis didn't respond, but as he left the room, her gaze followed him, sharp and calculating. The cracks in the alliance were growing, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the facade had shattered completely. But she would not falter. Whatever game Deyric was playing, Maelis would ensure that she came out on top no matter the cost. The storm had settled over Drevnar stronghold, the gray skies outside reflecting the tension that lingered within its towering black stone walls. Lady Maelis Velthorne stood on the balcony of her private chambers, the wind tugging at the crimson folds of her gown as she stared out at the jagged peaks. Her storm-gray eyes betrayed none of the unease that churned beneath her calm exterior. Her alliance with King Deyric Drevnar was a thread stretched taut, fraying at the edges. And in the quiet moments, when the weight of the game pressed hardest, she found herself questioning where the next blow might come from. A faint creak of the door drew her attention, but she didn't turn. She already knew who it was. "Kael," she said, her voice carrying over the wind. Kael Raventhorn stepped onto the balcony, his dark leather armor blending into the shadows cast by the overhanging arches. His green eyes, sharp and watchful, rested on her for a moment before shifting to the mountains beyond. "You don't rest," he said quietly. "Neither do you," Maelis replied, her tone clipped. "I assume you have a reason for interrupting?" Kael leaned against the stone railing, his gaze steady. "I came to warn you." Maelis turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Again? His lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile, though his eyes remained serious. You've seen the cracks forming, haven't you? Deyric's inner circle. His advisors. They're not as loyal as they appear. Her storm gray eyes narrowed, the wind tugging strands of dark hair loose from her braid. If you have something to say, Kael, stop speaking in riddles. Kael hesitated, his jaw tightening. All I can tell you is to watch your back. The threats to your life don't end with an assassin in a cloak. There are more subtle ways to kill a queen. Her frustration flared, though she kept her voice even. If you know something, tell me. I won't play this game blindfolded. Kael's gaze softened, but he didn't answer directly. You're smart, Maelis. Smarter than any of them give you credit for. Trust your instincts. Follow the whispers. And with that, he stepped back, retreating into the shadows as quietly as he had come. Kael's warning lingered in Maelis's mind, a thorn she couldn't ignore. The next morning, she summoned her closest advisors to her private council chamber. A circular room lined with bookshelves and lit by the pale morning sun streaming through high, narrow windows. Her second-in-command, Marla Greystone, stood by her side, her sharp hazel eyes reflecting Maelis's tension. Something isn't right, Maelis said, her voice low but firm. Deyric's advisors are hiding something. There's dissent in his court, and it's only a matter of time before it threatens us directly. Marla nodded, her expression grim. You think they're involved in the assassination attempt? I'd be a fool not to consider it, Maelis replied. Deyric is too practiced at deflection, too quick to place the blame elsewhere. If his advisors are plotting against me, or even against him, I need to know. She turned to the gathered spies who stood silently near the edge of the room, their dark cloaks blending with the shadows. Your task is simple. Watch Deyric's inner circle. Every word they speak, every action they take, I want it reported. Leave no stone unturned. The spies inclined their heads in unison before slipping out of the room like wraiths. As the chamber emptied, Maelis leaned against the edge of the council table, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the memory of Deyric's thin smile, the sharp glance he had exchanged with his wiry advisor during the wedding ceremony. Do you trust him? Marla asked quietly, breaking the silence. Maelis didn't hesitate. No. And neither should you. Marla's expression darkened, but she nodded. Then we stay vigilant. We don't just stay vigilant, Maelis said, her storm gray eyes flashing. We act. If there's a plot within Deyric's court, I'll uncover it. And when I do, I'll ensure that no one forgets who they're dealing with. As she spoke, the faint flicker of a shadow moved outside the window, a lone figure standing guard in the courtyard below. Kael's green eyes met hers briefly before he turned away, his posture stiff but alert. Maelis watched him for a moment, a mix of frustration and intrigue stirring within her. He was an enigma, a blade that could cut either way. And as much as she hated to admit it, she was beginning to trust him. But trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. The game had changed, and the pieces were moving faster than ever. And if Maelis was to survive, she would need to be sharper, stronger, and more ruthless than those who sought to destroy her. Chapter 8. A Shared Past. The Velthorne archives were a labyrinth of stone and shadow, their narrow corridors lined with shelves that groaned beneath the weight of centuries-old records. The faint scent of aged parchment and wax candles lingered in the air, a reminder of the knowledge and secrets entombed within these walls. Lady Maelis Velthorne stood at a worn oak table near the center of the archive's main chamber, her storm-gray eyes scanning a stack of yellowed documents. A single lantern cast a soft glow across her features, highlighting the sharp lines of her face and the faint crease in her brow. The records she sifted through were mundane at first: trade agreements, tax levies, and correspondences long past relevance. But as she turned another brittle page, a name leapt out at her, stopping her breath short. Kael Raventhorn. For a moment, Maelis stared at the name, her heart beating faster despite her usual composure. The document was an old census record, detailing the members of her house's servitor families from over 2 decades prior. Kael's name was listed alongside others, Mara Raventhorn and Theron Raventhorn, presumably his parents. The notes beside the entry confirmed it. They had been retainers of House Velthorne, tasked with managing one of the smaller estates near the borderlands. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the parchment as her thoughts raced. Kael had never spoken of his past, never hinted at any connection to her house. Yet here it was, written in black ink on brittle paper, a connection buried beneath years of silence. Maelis turned the page, her pulse quickening as she read further. The census noted that the Raventhorn family had fallen from favor after an incident involving treasonous accusations, details that had been conveniently omitted. Their lands had been seized, their title revoked, and the family had disappeared from the records shortly thereafter. Yet Kael had survived. She leaned back in her chair, the soft creak of the wood breaking the stillness of the archive. Her mind churned with questions, a storm of possibilities taking shape. Had Kael hidden this connection deliberately? Was his presence in Drevnar a coincidence or part of a larger scheme? And, most troubling of all, why had his family been branded traitors? The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the chamber, pulling Maelis from her thoughts. She glanced toward the entrance, her body tensing instinctively. When Kael Raventhorn stepped into the dim light of the archive, his green eyes immediately found hers. He hesitated, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene, the stack of documents, the parchment in her hands, and the look on her face that she couldn't quite mask. "You've been busy," he said, his voice low, the faintest hint of caution lacing his words. Maelis set the document down, her storm-gray eyes locking onto his. "And so have you, it seems." Kael's gaze flicked to the census record, his jaw tightening as understanding dawned. He stepped closer, the soft scrape of his boots on the stone floor the only sound in the room. "How long were you going to keep this from me?" Maelis asked, her tone sharp but not accusatory. Kael stopped a few paces from her, his green eyes shadowed. "It wasn't relevant." "Not relevant?" she echoed, her voice rising slightly. "You served a house your family once belonged to, a house that branded them traitors. And you thought that wasn't worth mentioning?" He didn't flinch under her scrutiny, though his shoulders stiffened. "My family's past has nothing to do with my role now. I came to serve, not to reopen old wounds." Maelis studied him, her mind racing. There was a weight to his words, a pain he didn't bother hiding. But there was also something else, a layer of resolve that told her this wasn't a simple omission. "Why, Kael?" she pressed, her voice softening. "Why did you come back?" His green eyes met hers, the intensity in his gaze stealing her breath for a moment. "Because I had nowhere else to go," he said quietly. "And because protecting you felt right." The vulnerability in his words surprised her, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by the familiar guarded expression she had grown used to. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken truths. Maelis's grip on the edge of the table tightened, her storm-gray eyes searching his face for answers he wasn't ready to give. "You knew this was my house," she said finally, her tone steady. "You knew, and you came anyway." Kael inclined his head, his voice calm but firm. "I did, and I don't regret it." Her heart stirred at his words, but she quickly buried the feeling beneath layers of caution. Kael was still an enigma, a blade that could cut both ways. But now she understood the weight he carried and the danger he represented. "Very well," she said, straightening. "But this changes things, Kael. If there's more I need to know, you'll tell me. No more secrets." Kael hesitated, his green eyes flickering with something unreadable. "I'll do what I can, Maelis," he said at last. It wasn't a promise, but it was enough for now. As he turned and left the archive, his shadow trailing behind him, Maelis watched him go, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Kael Raventhorn was a piece of her past she hadn't known she was missing. And whether he was a danger or a salvation, she couldn't yet say. The glow of the evening lanterns cast long, wavering shadows across the Velthorne archive, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. Lady Maelis Velthorne stood at the far end of the chamber, her back to the room, her storm-gray eyes fixed on the flickering flames of the hearth. Behind her, Kael Raventhorn lingered in the doorway, his presence steady but heavy with tension. He had returned her summons with the quiet resolve of a man stepping into the den of a predator, knowing full well what awaited him. "You knew," Maelis said, her voice soft but edged with steel. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Kael didn't answer immediately, his green eyes flickering toward the table where the census record lay. He stepped closer, his boots brushing against the cold stone floor. "I knew," he admitted, his voice low but steady. Maelis turned to face him, her expression a mask of composure, though her storm-gray eyes betrayed the storm within. "Then why didn't you tell me?" Kael met her gaze, his own sharp and unyielding. "Because it doesn't matter anymore. My past doesn't change why I'm here or what I'm meant to do." "It matters to me," Maelis countered, her voice rising slightly. "Your family served my house, Kael. They were branded traitors. And now you stand in my shadow, claiming loyalty but hiding the truth. Do you have any idea what that looks like?" His jaw tightened, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "I know exactly what it looks like," he said quietly. Maelis took a step closer, her gaze never leaving his. "Then explain it to me. Tell me why you're here, Kael. The truth this time." Kael exhaled slowly, his hands flexing at his sides as though grappling with the weight of his own words. "I was a child when it happened," he began, his voice low and rough. "My village was attacked raiders from the north. They burned everything. Killed anyone who couldn't fight back." Maelis remained silent, her expression sightening slightly as she listened. "I was lucky, if you can call it that. I survived long enough for your family's forces to arrive. They drove the raiders out, saved what was left. And when they found me, they didn't leave me behind." He paused, his green eyes meeting hers, his voice thick with something unspoken. "Your family took me in, gave me shelter, a chance to rebuild. I owe them my life. And that debt, it doesn't go away." Maelis's breath caught, the weight of his words settling over her. The sharp edges of her suspicion began to soften, replaced by something deeper, a flicker of understanding, of connection. "So, you came to Drevnar," she said slowly, "not for Deyric, but for me." Kael hesitated, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "I came because I couldn't ignore the debt. And because I knew that whatever game Deyric was playing, you'd need someone watching your back." Her heart stirred at his admission, but she quickly buried the feeling beneath her usual resolve. "And what do you expect in return, Kael? Redemption? Forgiveness?" "I expect nothing," he said firmly. "This isn't about me. It's about making sure you survive long enough to win whatever war you're fighting." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that stripped away pretense, leaving only raw truth between them. Maelis stepped closer, her storm-gray eyes softening as they searched his face. For the first time, she saw him not as the enigmatic shadow that trailed her, but as a man shaped by pain and loyalty, a man whose every action carried the weight of an unspoken bond. "You're impossible," she murmured, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Kael arched a brow, the tension in his posture easing slightly. "I've been called worse." She shook her head, a soft laugh escaping her lips, a sound so rare that it caught even her off guard. "You're still a mystery, Kael. But at least now I understand a little more." His green eyes lingered on her, their intensity softened by the faintest hint of vulnerability. "And what do you see, Maelis?" She hesitated, the words forming on her lips before she could stop them. "I see someone who's more than just my bodyguard. Someone I can trust, even if I don't want to." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy and electric. Kael didn't move, didn't speak, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. The moment stretched, charged with something neither of them dared name. Finally, Maelis stepped back, her composure returning like a shield being raised. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. Kael inclined his head, his voice steady but soft. "You deserve to know." As he turned to leave, Maelis found herself watching him, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Kael Raventhorn was no longer just a shadow at her side. He was a part of her story, tied to her in ways she hadn't expected, and in ways she couldn't ignore. And as the door closed behind him, she allowed herself a single thought: trust is dangerous, but perhaps he's worth the risk. The stillness of the night had settled over Drevnar's stronghold, its towering walls wrapped in a veil of shadow and silence. The faint hum of wind through the narrow stone corridors was the only sound, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. Lady Maelis Velthorne sat near the hearth in her private chambers, the glow of the fire casting a golden light across her sharp features. She held a goblet of wine in one hand, but the rich red liquid remained untouched, a silent witness to her restless thoughts. Across the room, Kael Raventhorn stood near the window, his figure framed by the faint moonlight that spilled through the panes. His presence was steady, his green eyes scanning the courtyard below, with the practiced vigilance of a man who trusted nothing and no one. "You're always watching," Maelis said, her voice cutting through the quiet. Kael turned slightly, his gaze meeting hers. "It's what I'm here for." She set the goblet down and leaned back in her chair, her storm-gray eyes studying him. "And what else are you here for, Kael? Surely you've noticed that Deyric's court is far from united." Kael hesitated, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. "I've noticed," he said carefully, his voice low. "And what do you make of it?" Maelis pressed, her tone sharp but not unkind. Kael stepped closer, the firelight catching the faint scar on his cheek. "Deyric is ambitious," he said, his words measured. "Ambition isn't inherently dangerous. But unchecked ambition, that's a different story." Maelis arched a brow, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "You're being diplomatic, Kael? I didn't think that was your style." "I've learned it has its uses," he replied, his expression softening. She leaned forward slightly, her storm-gray eyes locking onto his. "Do you trust him?" Kael's jaw tightened, the hesitation in his posture speaking volumes. "I trust him to look out for himself," he said finally, "and to use anyone in his way as a stepping stone." The words sent a chill down Maelis's spine, though she kept her expression composed. "Then we're in agreement," she said softly. "Deyric's alliance is a leash, and he's waiting for the right moment to tighten it." Kael studied her for a long moment, his green eyes searching her face. "You've known this for a while?" he said. It wasn't a question. Maelis nodded, the firelight flickering in her gaze. "Of course. I've played this game long enough to recognize a trap when I see one, but the stakes are too high to back out now." She paused, her voice softening. "That's why I need people I can trust. People who aren't just loyal to the crown, but to me." Kael's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes: respect, perhaps, or understanding. "Trust is dangerous," he said quietly. "And yet," Maelis replied, "it's the only currency that matters when the stakes are this high." The silence between them stretched, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Kael moved closer, his presence a steadying force in the room. "I've questioned Deyric's motives for a long time," he admitted, his voice low. "But the truth is, I'm more concerned about what happens if he decides you're more useful dead than alive." The bluntness of his words took Maelis by surprise, though she masked it quickly. "Then it's a good thing I have you watching my back," she said, a faint smile curving her lips. Kael's lips twitched in a rare hint of amusement. "You're not easy to protect, you know." "I wouldn't want to be," she countered, her tone laced with humor. Their eyes met, and the air between them shifted, subtle but undeniable. The tension that had always lingered between them took on a different hue, one that neither of them acknowledged aloud. Maelis's storm-gray gaze softened, the guarded edges of her expression easing for the briefest of moments. "You've given me more to think about than I'd like," she said quietly. Kael tilted his head slightly, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "That's what I'm here for." The moment stretched, charged with something unspoken, something fragile yet powerful. But just as quickly it passed. Maelis straightened, her composure returning like a shield. "Thank you, Kael," she said, her voice steady, "for your honesty and your loyalty." Kael inclined his head, his green eyes lingering on her for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Always," he said. As he turned and left the room, Maelis found herself staring at the door long after it had closed. Her thoughts churned, a mix of suspicion and something far more dangerous, trust. And beneath it all, a feeling she dared not name. Chapter 9. The Bodyguard's Secret. The midnight air was sharp and cold, carrying the faint metallic tang of approaching rain. Kael Raventhorn moved silently through the shadowed streets of Drevnar, his dark leather armor blending seamlessly with the night. The flicker of lanterns and distant windows barely pierced the oppressive darkness that clung to the alleys and narrow lanes, as though the city itself sought to swallow him whole. He had been summoned. The Raven Syndicate rarely made themselves known so openly, their power residing in whispers and unseen hands. Yet tonight, their call had come with urgency, delivered through a slip of parchment slid beneath his door, its ink marked with the symbol of a black feather. Kael's footsteps faltered as he reached the abandoned warehouse at the edge of the city. Its looming structure was draped in decay, the faint creak of warped wood breaking the silence as he approached. A single lantern burned within, its dim glow barely illuminating the interior. Inside, a figure waited, a man cloaked in black, his features obscured by the hood that hung low over his face. His voice, when it came, was low and cold, like the whisper of a blade being drawn. "You've been quiet, Kael," the man said, his words carrying a weight of unspoken threat. "Too quiet." Kael stopped a few paces away, his posture tense but calm. "I've had my hands full," he said evenly. "Deyric keeps me close to malice. There's little room for deviation." The hooded figure stepped closer, the dim light catching the glint of a wicked scar along his jaw. "And yet you're failing us. Your mission was clear. Gather intelligence on Maelis Velthorne, undermine her, weaken her position. Instead, you've spent your time protecting her." Kael's green eyes narrowed, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. "Protecting her is part of my role. Deyric needs her alive for this alliance to hold." "And what do you need, Kael?" the man pressed, his voice softening with mock curiosity. "Your loyalty to the Syndicate is wavering." "Is it her?" Kael's jaw tightened, the accusation slicing through his carefully maintained composure. "She's dangerous. That's why I watch her." The man chuckled, a dark and humorless sound. "Careful, Raventhorn. Danger has a way of becoming intoxicating. Remember your place. The Syndicate owns you. You do as you're told, or you'll find yourself back in the gutter where we found you." Kael said nothing, his silence speaking volumes. The hooded figure leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We want details, Kael. Her plans, her weaknesses. Deyric is a tool, nothing more. But Maelis, she's the real prize. Bring her down, and both houses crumble." The words hung in the air, heavy with expectation. Kael's mind churned, a storm of conflicting loyalties and unspoken truths. The Syndicate had saved him once, plucked him from the ashes of his past and given him purpose. But now that purpose was a chain tightening around his throat. And then there was Maelis. Fierce, calculating, and unyielding, she had become more than just a figure to guard. She was a force, one he found himself drawn to despite every instinct screaming against it. "I'll do what needs to be done," Kael said finally, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. The hooded man regarded him for a long moment before nodding. "Good. Don't disappoint us, Raventhorn. You know what's at stake." Without another word, the man disappeared into the shadows, leaving Kael alone in the dim light of the warehouse. When Kael returned to the stronghold, the halls were silent, their heavy stone walls shrouded in darkness. He moved through them like a ghost, his footsteps soundless as he made his way to Maelis Velthorne's private chambers. He stopped outside her door, his hand resting on the cold iron handle. For a moment he hesitated, his mind replaying the Syndicate's words. But then he pushed the door open. Inside, Maelis was seated by the hearth, her storm gray eyes flicking up to meet his as he entered. She said nothing at first, her gaze sharp and probing, as though she could sense the storm raging within him. "You're late," she said finally, her voice calm but edged with curiosity. "Unexpected detour," Kael replied, his tone even. She studied him for a long moment before gesturing to the chair across from her. "Sit. We need to talk." Kael complied, lowering himself into the seat. The firelight cast a warm glow over her features, softening the sharp edges of her expression. "What's on your mind, Maelis?" he asked, his voice low. Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "I should be asking you that. You've been distracted." Kael exhaled, his green eyes locking onto hers. "There's a lot at play. Deyric's court isn't exactly a haven of trust." "And you?" she pressed, her tone softening. "Where do you stand in all this, Kael?" The question caught him off guard, though he masked it quickly. "I stand where I've always stood. At your side." Her gaze lingered on him, the silence stretching between them like a taut string. "Good," she said finally. "Because I have a feeling the storm isn't over yet." Kael nodded, his resolve hardening. No matter the chains the syndicate sought to place on him, no matter the dangers ahead, one truth remained: he would protect Maelis, even if it meant defying the darkness that bound him. The Velthorne council chamber was cloaked in shadows, the flickering candlelight casting distorted shapes across the dark stone walls. Lady Maelis Velthorne stood at the head of the long table, a sheaf of documents spread before her. Her storm-gray eyes burned with cold fury as she scanned the contents, her fingers tightening on the parchment, as if it might crumble beneath the weight of her anger. The evidence lay bare: meticulously recorded trade movements, falsified manifests, and letters bearing the unmistakable seals of Deyric's advisors. It was no longer suspicion, it was fact. They were plotting to sabotage her trade routes, the lifeblood of her house's power. "Sabotage," she murmured, the word a venomous whisper that filled the chamber. Her trusted second-in-command, Marla Greystone, stood to her right, her sharp hazel eyes scanning the documents. "This was no accident," Marla said, her voice low but edged with steel. "They've been planning this for months, maybe longer. These delays, these missing shipments, they weren't random. They've been bleeding us slowly." Maelis's jaw tightened, her mind racing as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The alliance with Deyric had always been precarious, but this betrayal struck at the very foundation of her house. "This is how they weaken us," she said, her voice cold and measured. "They undermine our trade, destabilize our economy, and force us to become dependent on Deyric's protection. It's a calculated power grab." Marla nodded grimly. "And if we don't act now, they'll succeed." Maelis straightened, her crimson gown flowing like blood as she moved to the window overlooking the Velthorne stronghold. The jagged peaks of the mountains loomed in the distance, their sharp edges a reflection of her own resolve. "They think they can outmaneuver me," she said, her voice low but filled with deadly determination. "They forget who they're dealing with." Marla hesitated. "What's the plan, my lady?" "We hit back," Maelis said, her storm-gray eyes glinting with cold fire. "But not yet. First we let them think they've succeeded. Let them grow bold, careless. And when they move to claim their victory, we strike." A faint smile tugged at Marla's lips, her admiration for her leader evident. "They won't know what hit them." The sound of the chamber doors opening drew their attention. Kael Raventhorn stepped inside, his dark leather armor blending with the shadows as he approached. His green eyes flicked to Maelis, their sharp intensity softening just slightly as they took her in. "You called for me," he said, his voice low and steady. Maelis nodded, gesturing for Marla to leave them. Her second-in-command bowed briefly before exiting, leaving the two of them alone in the dimly lit chamber. Kael moved closer, his presence as commanding as the blade at his side. "What have you uncovered?" "Proof," Maelis said, her tone sharp. She pushed the documents toward him, her storm-gray eyes locked onto his. "Deyric's advisors are plotting to dismantle my trade routes. They've been working in the shadows, but now we have their signatures, their plans. Kael scanned the documents, his green eyes narrowing. This isn't just betrayal. It's war. Maelis crossed her arms, her posture unyielding. And war is what they'll get, but on my terms. I need you to ensure our defenses are ready. I won't let them take what's mine. Kael set the documents down, his gaze lingering on her. You're not surprised, he said softly, his voice carrying an edge of admiration. No, she admitted, her voice quieter now, but knowing it doesn't make it easier. Deyric is playing a game, and his advisors are pieces he's willing to sacrifice. But this is personal. Kael took a step closer, his presence steadying her, even as it sent a ripple of tension through the air. You don't have to do this alone, he said, his voice low. Maelis's storm-gray eyes met his, and for a moment the mask of the calculating leader slipped, revealing the woman beneath the one who carried the weight of an entire house on her shoulders. I know, she said, her voice softer now. That's why I called for you. Kael inclined his head, his green eyes filled with quiet resolve. Then let's make them regret ever underestimating you. For a moment, the world outside the chamber seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them standing on the precipice of something far greater than themselves. Maelis straightened, the fire in her gaze returning. Prepare the defenses, Kael, and keep a close eye on Deyric's advisors. I want to know their every move. As you wish, Kael said, his voice carrying a promise. As he turned to leave, Maelis found herself watching him, the storm of her thoughts briefly stilled by his unwavering presence. She had uncovered the betrayal that threatened her house, but with Kael at her side, she felt a flicker of hope, a dangerous, fragile thing in a world built on shadows and lies. And as the door closed behind him, she whispered to herself, let them come. The throne room of Drevnar Stronghold was an architectural masterpiece of dark majesty. Its high, vaulted ceilings seemed to scrape the heavens, while polished obsidian walls reflected the faint flicker of the torches that lined the chamber. At its heart sat King Deyric Drevnar, lounging on his imposing black throne, his pale blue eyes gleaming with calculated indifference. Opposite him stood Lady Maelis Velthorne, her crimson gown a stark contrast to the cold shadows of the room. Her storm-gray eyes burned with fury, her every movement sharp and deliberate as she approached the dais. We need to talk, she said, her voice slicing through the heavy silence like a blade. Deyric tilted his head, his thin lips curving into a faint smirk. By all means, my queen. What troubles you? Maelis stopped at the base of the throne, her storm-gray gaze locking onto his. Don't play coy, Deyric. I've seen the records. Your advisors are sabotaging my trade routes, undermining the lifeblood of my house. This alliance was supposed to strengthen us both, but instead it reeks of betrayal. Deyric's smirk faded, his pale blue eyes narrowing. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the arms of the throne, his fingers steepled. Those are bold accusations, Maelis. Dangerous ones. They're not accusations, she snapped, her tone icy. They're facts. Facts that you would do well to address before I take matters into my own hands. The air between them crackled with tension, the weight of unspoken threats hanging heavy in the room. Deyric rose from his throne with deliberate slowness, his imposing figure casting a long shadow that seemed to stretch toward her. You forget yourself, Maelis, he said, his voice low and edged with menace. This alliance was forged on my terms. You needed my strength to secure your house, and now you stand here accusing me of treachery. Perhaps you should reconsider your tone. Maelis didn't flinch, her storm-gray eyes flashing with defiance. Perhaps you should reconsider your actions, Deyric. You think I'm blind to your games, to the way you manipulate those around you? Deyric stepped closer, his presence suffocating. Be careful, Maelis. My patience has limits. And so does mine, she countered, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. For a moment they stood in silence, locked in a battle of wills. Finally, Deyric leaned back, his smirk returning. You're a formidable woman, Maelis. But remember this, alliances are fragile things. Break this one, and you'll find yourself standing alone in a world that would gladly see you fall. Deyric's words lingered in the air as Maelis turned on her heel and strode out of the throne room, her heart pounding with a mix of fury and resolve. The cold corridors of the stronghold echoed with the sharp click of her heels, the shadows seeming to stretch and shift around her, as though reflecting her inner turmoil. She had known from the beginning that Deyric was dangerous, but now, the depth of his ambition was clearer than ever. He was not her partner, he was her adversary, his every move calculated to tighten his grip on her house and her power. As she reached the sanctuary of her chambers, Maelis allowed herself a moment to breathe, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She could no longer rely on Deyric's pretense of unity. She needed to act. And she needed Kael Raventhorn. The thought of Kael brought a sense of calm she hadn't expected. He was an enigma, a man bound by secrets and shadows, but he had proven himself time and again. His loyalty, though complicated, was something she could count on. Summoning a piece of parchment, Maelis began sketching a rough plan, her mind racing with possibilities. She would need to consolidate her forces, secure her trade routes, and root out Deyric's allies within her own court. But most importantly, she would need someone she could trust to protect her from the dangers that loomed on every side. Her storm-gray eyes flicked toward the window, where the faint light of the moon cast an eerie glow over the mountains beyond. "Kael," she murmured to herself, her voice soft but resolute. "It's time to act." With a determined breath, Maelis straightened and moved to the door. The pieces of her plan were falling into place, and she wouldn't rest until she had ensured her survival and her victory. Chapter 10. Forbidden Ties. The night was heavy with the scent of rain, the low rumble of distant thunder echoing through the vast corridors of Drevnar stronghold. The faint flicker of torches barely pierced the oppressive darkness, casting long, wavering shadows across the stone walls. Lady Maelis Velthorne stood near the window of her private chambers, her storm-gray eyes fixed on the horizon. The jagged peaks of the mountains were shrouded in mist, their sharp edges softened by the night's gloom. But her mind was anything but soft. It churned with strategy and suspicion, the weight of her position pressing down on her like the encroaching storm. The sound of the door opening drew her from her thoughts. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Kael Raventhorn moved like a shadow, his presence a quiet force that seemed to fill the room without effort. "I didn't summon you," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. Kael stepped closer, his dark leather armor glinting faintly in the firelight. "I know," he replied, his voice low. "But we need to talk." Maelis turned then, her sharp gaze locking onto his. "This had better be important." Kael hesitated, a rare crack in his composed exterior. His green eyes flicked to the floor before meeting hers again, and for the first time, Maelis saw something she hadn't expected: vulnerability. "There's something you need to know," he said, his voice quieter now. "Something I should have told you long ago." Her storm-gray eyes narrowed, her arms crossing over her chest. "Go on." Kael exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture betraying the weight of his words. "I'm tied to the Raven Syndicate. They found me years ago, after my family was destroyed. They gave me purpose, a way to survive. But their loyalty isn't free, it comes with chains." Maelis's expression hardened, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Chains that brought you here? That made you their spy?" Kael didn't flinch under her sharp gaze. "At first, yes. They wanted me close to you, to gather intelligence, to undermine your house." Her fury flared, her hands balling into fists. "You've been lying to me this entire time." "I have," he admitted, his voice raw. "But things changed. You changed them." Maelis's mind raced, her anger battling with the cold logic she had honed over years of navigating the treacherous waters of politics and power. Kael's confession was a betrayal, but it was also an opportunity. She stepped closer, her storm-gray eyes burning with calculated intensity. "You expect me to trust you after this? After you've admitted you've been working against me?" Kael met her gaze, his green eyes steady. "I don't expect anything. But I'm telling you because I've made a choice. The Syndicate wants to see you fall. But I won't let that happen." Maelis's lips curved into a cold smile, her sharp mind already weaving a new plan. "And why should I believe that? What makes me so different from all the other marks they've sent you after? Kael's jaw tightened, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Because I care about you, Maelis. More than I should. More than they'd ever understand. Her breath caught, though she quickly buried the reaction beneath layers of composure. The vulnerability in his words was a weapon, one she could wield but only if she could trust the hand that offered it. Care, she repeated, her voice softer now but no less sharp. Care isn't enough, Kael. Not in this world. I know, he said, his green eyes locked onto hers. That's why I'm standing here, telling you the truth. I'll protect you, Maelis, even if it means betraying the syndicate, even if it costs me my life. The weight of his vow settled over the room, thick and suffocating. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to echo the storm within her. Betray them, and they'll come for you, she said, her voice low. Kael nodded, his expression resolute. Let them. My loyalty isn't theirs anymore. Maelis studied him, her sharp gaze searching for cracks in his resolve, but all she saw was truth, dangerous, reckless truth. Very well, she said finally, her voice steady. If you're serious about this, you'll prove it. Your knowledge of the syndicate could be invaluable. But if you betray me again... I won't, Kael interrupted, his voice firm. The air between them crackled with tension, an unspoken connection that neither dared maim. Then we move forward, Maelis said, her tone final. Together. But know this, Kael, if you fall, I won't catch you. Kael's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. I wouldn't expect you to. As he turned to leave, Maelis watched him, her mind a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't afford to feel. Kael's confession had shaken the fragile foundation of their alliance, but it had also strengthened something deeper, something she couldn't yet define. And as the door closed behind him, she allowed herself a single thought: trust is dangerous, but perhaps he's worth the risk. The air in the Velthorne war room was thick with tension, the glow of lanterns illuminating the sprawling map spread across the heavy oak table. Tiny markers denoting trade routes, strongholds, and key players of Deyric's court lay scattered, each one a piece of a puzzle that promised betrayal and chaos. Lady Maelis Velthorne stood at the table's edge, her storm-gray eyes scanning the map with unrelenting focus. She was the picture of controlled power, her crimson gown flowing around her like blood spilled on stone. Across from her, Kael Raventhorn leaned forward, his green eyes sharp and calculating. His presence was a quiet storm, coiled and ready to strike, a reflection of the dangerous energy that simmered between them. We know Deyric's advisors are sabotaging the trade routes, Maelis said, her voice cutting through the silence. But these movements, she pointed to a series of lines etched across the northern border, suggest something bigger. This isn't just about destabilizing my house. It's about seizing control entirely. Kael's jaw tightened as he studied the map. And the syndicate? They're tied to this, Maelis replied. I can feel it, but the pieces don't fit yet. We need more. Kael nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. Then we'll find it. Hours later, Maelis and Kael moved through the lower corridors of Drevnar, the chill of the stone walls seeping into the air. Word of a secret meeting among Deyric's inner circle had reached them, and Maelis wasn't one to let an opportunity slip by. Kael walked beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. You didn't need to come, he said, his voice low. I'm not leaving this to chance, Maelis replied sharply, her storm-gray eyes fixed ahead. If Deyric's advisors are plotting, I need to hear it myself. Kael's lips twitched in a faint smirk, stubborn as ever. Efficient, she corrected, casting him a sidelong glance. They reached the shadowed alcove where the meeting was said to take place. The muffled voices of Deyric's advisors drifted through the narrow crack of a heavy iron door, their words punctuated by the occasional clink of glasses. Maelis pressed a finger to her lips, signaling Kael to stay silent. Together, they leaned closer, catching fragments of the conversation. Velthorne's trade routes are already vulnerable, one voice said. Once we push her house into dependency, She'll have no choice but to concede, another added, the smugness in their tone unmistakable. Maelis's grip tightened on the hilt of her dagger, the cool steel grounding her. She exchanged a glance with Kael, whose expression mirrored her fury. Not tonight, Kael whispered, his green eyes locking onto hers. We can't risk exposing ourselves yet. Reluctantly, Maelis nodded. They had what they needed, confirmation of the plot. But as they retreated into the shadows, the weight of the conspiracy settled heavily between them. By the time they returned to her chambers, the hour was late, the castle bathed in moonlight. Maelis moved to the hearth, the flames casting a warm glow across her sharp features. Kael lingered near the door, his posture tense. We have our proof, he said, breaking the silence. But not our solution, Maelis replied, her voice heavy with frustration. Deyric's grip on my house tightens with every passing day. If we don't act soon, you'll act, Kael interrupted, his voice steady. You always do. She turned to face him, her storm gray eyes searching his. And if I fall? What then? You won't, he said firmly, stepping closer. The air between them shifted, charged with something neither of them dared name. For a moment, the world outside her chambers seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them standing in the quiet firelight. You've always believed in me, Maelis said softly, her voice carrying an unspoken question. Kael's green eyes darkened, his expression unguarded for the first time. Because I know who you are. And because he stopped, the words catching in his throat. The silence stretched, heavy with tension and unspoken desire. Kael reached for her then, his hand brushing against hers. The contact was electric, sending a jolt through her that left her breathless. Maelis, he murmured, his voice low and raw. Her storm gray eyes searched his, and for the briefest of moments, she let herself feel the pull between them, the fragile, dangerous connection that had grown stronger with every shared glance, every whispered word. But then, just as quickly, she pulled away, stepping back as if the distance might sever the bond entirely. We can't, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Whatever this is, it's too dangerous. For both of us. Kael's expression didn't waver, though his green eyes burned with something she couldn't name. Danger is all I know, Maelis, and I'd face it 1,000 times over, if it meant keeping you safe. Her breath hitched, the weight of his words pressing against the wall she had built around herself. But she shook her head, her resolve hardening. You're my bodyguard, Kael, she said, her tone sharper now. Nothing more. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but it was a necessary one. Kael inclined his head, though the fire in his eyes didn't dim. As you wish. As he turned and left the room, Maelis sank into the nearest chair, her storm gray eyes fixed on the flames. The fire crackled softly, a reminder of the heat that lingered between them, heat that could burn them both if they weren't careful.